Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Roboutian Heresy in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Index: Asteroutes, Salamanders, Lords of Greed and Pride. Arrogant and cruel, the Salamanders are heirs to their Primarch's unbridled power. From their very inception, dark rumors circulated about them, but by the time the full extent of their corruption was revealed, it was too late to stop them. The blood of two Primarchs stains the hands of Fukin, who has long since shed the last trace of humanity left in him to become a daemon prince of chaos. Their flesh twisted to reflect the darkness of their souls, the Salamanders are a plague upon the galaxy, enslaving all those who fall before them and plundering their riches to sate their immortal greed. Like the ancient drakes of myth, they are unrestrained in the exercise of their power, unburdened by any thought of morality or compassion. With dark fire and blades inscribed with unholy runes, they crush all those who come before them, selfishly striving to emulate the greatness of their Primarch. Meanwhile, the Black Dragon, who slumbers in his lair, awaits the call of great plunder to rise once more, and rain doom upon the worlds of mankind. Origins: born of fire. Knowledge of the traitor legion's very existence is forbidden in the Imperium to all but an elite few, imperial commanders and officers, planetary governors on regions plagued by raiders, the loyal Space Marine legions and, of course, the agents of the Holy Ordos. But there are histories that have been lost to the passage of time, and others that have faded into little more than legend and myth, whose truth is known only to the God Emperor and those dark souls that still dwell beyond the rings of the iron cages, their memory made bitter by 10,000 years of exile and damnation. Such is the case of Fukin's legend. Most of the Black Dragon's history is forever lost to us, and the few kernels of fact that remain to us point at a legacy darker and more terrible than perhaps any other of the traitor Primarchs, even the arch-traitor Guilliman himself. The tale of Fukin's life is one of loss and dread triumph, and if the ramblings of those driven insane by studying this saga are to be believed, it is one that is far from completion yet. Like all Primarchs, Fukin was stolen from the Emperor's gene laboratories by the machinations of the ruinous powers and cast across the galaxy. He landed on the world of Nocturne, a death world located in the Ultima Segmentum. Circled by an oversized moon named Prometheus, Nocturne was constantly ravaged by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that made permanent construction impossible. Life on that planet, for the few unfortunate souls descended of the colonists who had crashed there centuries before, was harsh and short. By the standards of the Imperium, the planet would have been classified as a death world. Unlike the other Primarchs, Fukin was not found by another member of the human species as a child, nor did he wander alone until his path came to cross that of another descendant of distant Terra. Instead, the young demigod was found by one of Nocturne's great beasts, a gigantic reptilian creature hundreds of years old, who was the subject of legends and campfire stories for the scattered tribes of the surrounding regions. Kazare, they called the beast, one of the great salamanders, predators who slumbered deep below Nocturne's surface and were only roused by the time of trials, when Prometheus and Nocturne were closest and the world screamed under gravitic forces. Fukin's life pod crashed in the deep volcanic crater at the bottom of which Kazare had made her lair. Her sleep interrupted, the beast rose and approached the source of the disturbance. She found Fukin emerging from the pod as an infant, and by all rights the life of the young Primarch should have ended there and then, an outcome that would have been much better for the galaxy. But instead, moved by some primordial instinct, the salamander attached herself to the child as if it were her own. For almost 10 Terran standard years, Fukin remained in isolation with Kazare, raised by the great beast. The salamander left the crater to hunt and bring back the carcasses of other, lesser examples of Nocturne's megafauna, so that Fukin might feed upon them. She also brought in living specimens, and Fukin learned how to fight and kill for himself. Feeding on the rich meat of Nocturne's beasts, Fukin grew quickly and strong, his body further toughened by the harsh conditions of his lair. The crater in which he lived was fairly secure, but rock falls from the sides, flows of lava bursting from the depths and radiation-poisoned winds were common. It is believed that it was during that time that his skin darkened and his eyes took on their glowering red tint, as an adaptive response to the hostile conditions. But the first true challenge Fukin would face came when, after 10 years, the instincts of Kazare moved on to their next phase. Nocturne's salamanders were fiercely protecting of their young, as they must be for the species to have any chance of surviving on that harsh world. But once their spawn had reached a certain age, their children became rivals for limited food resources, and needed to leave the nest and carve their own territory. Normally, young salamanders knew this instinctively, but Fukin was no mere beast, and so, when the creature he had come to consider his own mother suddenly turned on him, he was caught completely by surprise. Agony. It coursed through his body as the claws of his mother tore through his flesh. Never in all his life had he ever known such pain. He had been wounded before, when he had fought the beasts she had brought so that he would learn to defend himself, but never like this. His belly had been torn open, though his organs remained inside, something that had never happened with any of his previous foes but did little to diminish the terrible pain. Again and again she stroked at him, and it was all he could do to raise his arms in defense, until he felt too weak to even do that. Then the claws came for his throat and he fell, a crimson torrent pouring from his ravaged body. Darkness took him. And then, in a flash of light and heat, his eyes snapped open. There was no more pain. He looked, and saw that his body was whole, though the ground was still soaked with his blood. The weakness from moments ago was gone, yet his mother was still staring down at him, her claws red with his blood. She had killed him, yet he lived again, and though she appeared confused, her confusion quickly gave way to renewed fury and she lunged toward him once more. He lived again, but if he did nothing, he would die again. With a mighty roar, he rose to his feet and punched the reptilian creature in the side of her jaw, sending her tumbling to the ground with greater force than he had ever displayed before. He felt as if his body was on fire, fueled by the very power of the ground on which he stood. He would not be a helpless victim of this creature's rage any longer. He would not let her hurt him. He would never let anything hurt him. And if that meant that he had to kill her, then so be it. But he was a Primarch, and emerged victorious, though not before making a terrible discovery, that would set him apart from the rest of his brothers forever. Fukin could not die. After being slain by Kazare in the battle's first moments, he had risen from the dead, restored to full health and possessed of even greater vigor than before, and defeated the creature that had raised him since infancy. It was then that Fukin learned that he was a perpetual, though he would not learn that term and what it meant until much, much later in his life. The perpetuals. Death is inevitable. It is the one thing that binds all members of the human species together, from the lowest dreg in the underhive to the Lord Governor of an entire sector, all are bound by the inevitability of death. The Emperor alone, so the Ecclesiarchy teaches us, is beyond death, and even then, it is because he moved beyond it when he shed his human form and became a god. Even Zeno's species must obey the same law, and save for the unliving legions of the Necrons or the accursed spirits of the Neverborn, all things must eventually face the Reaper. To have a soul, no matter how wretched or tainted, is to live in the shadow of death. Except that such is not the case, and in the deepest archives of the Inquisition, the truth is written behind half-forgotten myths and legends. There are those who are untouched by death, who go through the passage of millennia unaffected. Hundred upon hundred of years might pass, and yet they remain the same, returning even from the most hideous and complete death looking none the worse for wear. They are known as the Perpetuals, and each of them is a power in him or herself, not because of any particular power they might possess, they have none save for the ability to return from death, but because of the skills they have picked up during their long, multiple lives. The fact that Fukin, the only perpetual Primarch, turned against the Imperium and the Emperor, has led many of the Inquisitors aware of their existence to hunt down the Perpetuals as potential agents of chaos. But apart from the Black Dragon, none of these immortals have ever been known to bow before the Dark Gods. It is possible that the ruinous powers have nothing to offer to an immortal, or that the wisdom and knowledge that comes with such a long existence inevitably reveals the primordial annihilator for the abomination that it is, making submission to its insane evil impossible for any sane being. Still, those arguing for the systematic hunting and capture of the Perpetuals argue that for someone who does not know death, the lives of all those around are, by necessity, lessened in value. What does one mortal life matters to an immortal, after all? Once victorious, Fukin set to work, and crafted for himself a cloak and suit of armor from the corpse of the beast, wearing her skull upon his shoulder. He then turned his attention on how to escape the great crater that had been his world for years. Within a few days, he was climbing out, following the steps left in the walls by the claws of his beast mother. Outside, he beheld Nocturne's landscape for the first time, a desolate land, riven by earthquakes and lava eruptions. He also saw, in the far distance, the signs of civilization, and his long-dormant instincts told him that he would find more of his kind there. Despite the dangers of their world, the people of Nocturne had managed to build 7 cities on places where the land was the least agitated. The city found by Fukin, Hesiod, was called the Seat of Kings, and was the most influential of the sanctuaries of Nocturne. When Fukin presented himself at the city's doors, he was welcomed in, though the guards' surprise at seeing a lone wanderer survive to reach their gate quickly turned to shock and fear when they saw him up close. To the mortal eye, Fukin was a black-skinned giant with burning red eyes, clad in the skin of one of Nocturne's most powerful beasts and wearing its skull upon his shoulder. They fell on their knees before his might, awed and terrified in equal measure. Fukin was introduced to Hesiod's ruler, and after only a few days he was capable of speaking fluently in Nocturne's harsh, but strangely poetic language. By some strange twist of fate, Fukin saw a blacksmith's shop while visiting the city, and asked to work there. Something in the shaping of the metal, in the creation of instruments of war and peace, appealed to him, and seeing his cloak, the blacksmith welcomed him with open arms. In only a few days, Fukin had surpassed his first teacher. Within a few weeks, he was the greatest smith in all of Hesiod. Half a Nocturnian year after Fukin's arrival to Hesiod, one of the many cataclysms of plaguing the death world happened once more. Unlike the fury of the earth or the beasts that roamed in the wasteland, this scourge came from beyond Nocturne. It came from the dark places between realities, where the scions of dread Comeric dwell. For centuries, dark Eldar slavers had preyed upon the people of Nocturne, hunting them down for sport and capturing them as slaves. Hardy and resilient, the Nocturnians made excellent slaves for the cruel Xenos, known to their victims as the myth-shrouded Dusk Wraiths. This time, however, things were different. A Primarch was here. Fukin fought the Dusk Wraiths in the streets of Hesiod, killing dozens of them and leading the city's people into repelling the Xenos. The king of Hesiod had been slain in the confusion. Dark rumors claim that he was killed not by the Dusk Wraiths, but by Fukin himself. The Lord of Drakes, as he was called by the grateful population, was offered the throne, which he seized immediately before calling his people to war. The Dusk Wraiths were still harassing the other cities, and he intended to free them from the invaders' depredations. Within a few weeks, Fukin had crafted powerful weapons for Hesiod's most powerful warriors, those who had proven themselves in his eyes when fighting back the Wraiths in the city's streets. City by city, Fukin and his army fought and defeated the Dusk Wraiths, gaining new followers at each step of the way. However, by the time they reached the 7th city, Skarek, the Dark Eldar had escalated their activities, driven into a frenzy by the news of their prey's unexpectedly fighting back. When Fukin entered the Dragon Spine, as Skarek was known, it had become a pit of horrors, where the only living humans were kept in a state of perpetual agony by their tormentors' cruel devices. Fukin's army marched through the city, their heart full of vengeance, but it was all they could do to end the victims' pain. The Dusk Wraiths had long since departed. Fukin swore that such an atrocity would never happen again. He declared that Skarek would stand forever as a reminder to the rest of the cities of the price of weakness, and the need for strong, unified leadership. With almost no opposition, Fukin was proclaimed master of the 6 remaining city sanctuaries, and began to work on rebuilding Nocturne according to his own vision. A powerful military was created, led by warlords equipped with weapons and armor crafted by Fukin's own hands, and hunted the beasts around the cities, making it safer for the people to mine the prodigious wealth of Nocturne's earth. Under Fukin's rule, Nocturne became a much safer place for its people. Fukin had a nearly preternatural instinct for predicting the shifts in the earth, and was able to prevent much of the yearly death toll that had become part of Nocturnian life. Out of respect and fear for their coal-skinned overlord, the 6 cities sent prodigious amounts of gemstones and precious minerals to Fukin's throne in Hesiod. With these, the Lord of Drakes forged weapons, but also wondrous works of art that were exposed in his castle, and people flocked from all over Nocturne to see them. It was the first time in recorded Nocturnian history that the clans had the opportunity to truly enjoy beauty, rather than fight for survival. At the same time, Fukin did not tolerate dissent, and those who opposed his rule or spoke out against him were quickly disposed of by his loyal supporters. The only exception were those who possessed useful skills or connections. They were brought before Fukin himself, where the natural presence of the Primarch soon overwhelmed them and turned them into the most devoted servants of the Lord of Drakes. Peace and civil order were maintained through an unyielding military rule, and all were expected to serve the will of Fukin. This system was brutal, but effective, and perhaps the only one that could have worked on a death world such as Nocturne. We will never know. When the Emperor came to Nocturne, he found his son at the head of a powerful and prosperous empire, carved out of the savagery of a world that might very well have claimed his life. The master of mankind descended on Nocturne in disguise, and used the ancient rituals of trial of the world to challenge Fukin's might and intellect. Fukin emerged triumphant in every trial, and demanded to know who was this outsider who dared to question his fitness to rule. Then the Emperor revealed himself in his true glory, and Fukin knew that he had finally found someone who did not stand, by their very nature, beneath him. It is said that he laughed when he saw the Emperor, the first time he ever did so in the memory of his servants, for he believed that, at long last, he would no longer be alone. There are even tales that the Emperor joined in his son's joy, in a display of the innocence that would later be so cruelly shattered. The Emperor told Fukin of the greater galaxy, of the thousands of worlds that needed to be brought out of the darkness and into the light of civilization. He praised Fukin's work on Nocturne, and spoke of the legion that had been crafted from his blood. This legion, the sons of Fukin, direly needed his leadership, but first, the Lord of Drakes needed to learn the knowledge he would require to fulfill his role as a general of the Imperium's Great Crusade. He also told the young Primarch about his brothers, those who had been created in the same way he had been. Eager to meet his siblings and face the new challenges of the Great Crusade, Fukin accepted the Emperor's offer. He left the ruling of Nocturne to his subordinates, but ensured that they would have the Imperium's support, and that the children of the 6 cities would be tested for the honor of joining his legion. For several years after that, Fukin fought at the side of the Emperor, his true nature kept a secret while he learned the skills of a commander and the structure and technology of the Imperium. Rumors about the mysterious warrior clad in green draconic armor spread widely across the forces of the Great Crusade, and speculation as to his true nature was rife, until the day the Emperor judged Fukin to be ready to reveal himself and take the place that was rightfully his. The Great Crusade, tyrants among shepherds. On the anvil of war are the strong-tempered and the weak made to perish, thus are men's souls tested as metal in the forge's fire. We are the champions of this new age, my sons, and we shall forge the future of all mankind with our deeds. Like the blacksmith shaping the blade, we cannot afford to be kind to the material we use, only by beating it into shape shall we make it strong enough to weather the passage of time and threats. For make no mistake, there are threats uncounted waiting in the stars, Xenos that would see mankind wiped out from the galaxy if they had the chance, and the legacies of our ancestors' failures slumbering on forgotten worlds, waiting for the foolish to rouse them once more. Only through strength can we defend ourselves from these perils, by crushing all those who oppose the Imperium's right to rule the stars. Greatest of all those dangers, however, is disunity. When mankind first took to the stars, it scattered without care no plan, the leaders of each colony ship seeking to create their own isolated society. This mistake cost them terribly, for no world can stand alone in this universe. Even if they resist us, even if they refuse the gift of compliance, we must force it down their throat no matter how much damage is done to the process, because without us, they will die at the hands of one threat or the other, and that threat will grow stronger from feasting upon them before coming for us next. The people of the Imperium might look at you and see monsters, weapons of war removed from humanity by the gene forging that made you what you are. And perhaps they are right, but it does not matter. All that matters is that mankind needs armies strong enough to survive, and you are that army. You are the salamanders, the primordial beasts bound to the Emperor's will, that he might bring order to the stars and strength to mankind. Let nothing stand in our way as we conquer the galaxy for my father. Let none oppose us, for to fail is to do far worse than die, it is to sentence our entire species to extinction, as we become no more than another footnote in galactic history, to be forgotten by those who will rise from our ashes. But we will not be broken by that endless, vicious, and cruel cycle. We shall master it, and in doing so, we shall become immortal. Passage from the decree of Primarch Fukin, after taking command of the 18th Legion. Even before Fukin's discovery, the 18th Legion's reputation was a dark one. Their creation had been shrouded in secrecy by the Emperor, their first warriors kept away from the other legions for unknown purposes. Dark rumors circulated among the citizens of the Emperor's domain, especially when the only 2 other legions to be treated this way were the 6th and the 20th, both of which would come to be feared and reviled in equal measure over time. though for very different reasons and with a very different outcome. The appearance of the legionaries only aggravated the issue. While foolish discrimination based on skin color had long since disappeared in an Imperium fighting against the mutated horrors created by the techno-barbarians, the 18th Legion's gene seed caused those it was implanted into to develop thick, scale-like black skin and red, glowing eyes. These traits gave them an inhuman appearance that surpassed the mere size and proportions of a transhuman, and combined with the attitude of these warriors on the battlefield, fearful whispers of devils and monsters spread among the human forces deployed alongside them. The warriors of the 18th Legion were first revealed to the rest of the Emperor's servants near the end of the Unification Wars, when they were unleashed in the assault on the Tempest Galleries. This was during the final extermination of the Ethnarchy, a cabal of insane gene twisters controlling thousands of enhanced transhumans of their own and circles of chemically enslaved psychers, as well as possessing many technological relics of immense power. Earlier in the Unification Wars, the Ethnarchy had been contained in the Caucasus wastes at a terrible price, millions had been lost, and more than 10,000 Thunder Warriors had perished as well. Using burrowing engines, the 20,000 Astaroutes of the 18th Legion infiltrated the Ethnarchy's last fortress from below in order to sabotage its massive and powerful defenses. At the core of the fortress, they fought not against flesh and blood, but the antique, near-sentient constructs that were tasked with the defense of the complex which drained energy from the very molten core of Terra. Between the brutally hostile environment and their highly intelligent and powerful foes, it took all the Astaroutes had to triumph. They finally succeeded in silencing the malevolent machine spirit that dominated the complex, sending its cogitators down into an ocean of lava, but by that time, less than 1,000 of them remained. Without its defense grid, the last city of the Ethnarchy fell, its leader brought in chains before the Emperor so that he might learn the secrets that had allowed this blasphemous kingdom to stand in his way for so long. While the 18th Legion earned much honor for this battle, with its numbers so dramatically reduced, it was unable to join the Great Crusade as soon as other legions. Instead of being deployed as one massive force, the Sons of Missing Fukin were assigned in small groups to individual forces needing Astaroot's support. Scattered across the Great Crusade, these groups rarely amounted to more than 100 warriors, an elite force for the commander of the expeditionary fleet to call upon in case of dire need. This meant that every battle the legionaries experienced was dangerous and desperate even by the standards of Astaroutes, and casualty rates remained as high as the honors the legion continued to gain over the dead bodies of its members. This created a brutal mentality among the warriors of the legion, who did not expect to live long and only saw value in their lives if they died honorable and worthy deaths. The coming of Fukin changed all that. For all his faults and later treachery, there is no denying that during the Great Crusade, Fukin was fiercely protective of his sons' lives. Whether this was due to any genuine bond, the duty of a general to his soldiers, or the callous calculation of a warlord seeking to preserve his most valuable assets, the Lord of Drakes made sure to change his sons' mentality. He named them the Salamanders, so that they would carry on the legacy of strength and near invincibility of these great beasts. He gathered them all in one force, not hesitating a single moment to use his Primarch's authority to revoke the oaths that had bound them to other armies. United under his command and with fresh recruits coming in from Nocturne, the 18th Legion was saved from the brink of annihilation and reborn as a potent fighting force for the Great Crusade. In barely a few years, the Salamanders' numbers were in the thousands once more, and a century after the Crusade had begun they were, if not the most numerous legion, at last no longer considered in danger of dying off. Fukin's time as ruler of Nocturne had given him a keen eye for ambition among mortal men, and he quickly formed a web of allegiances with other commanders, offering his legions support, but also personal presents of weapons and armor crafted with his own hands. The commanders of the Imperial Army honored with such princely gifts dedicated the forces under their command to Fukin's endeavors in the Crusade, and would later form the core of the human armies who turned against the Emperor alongside him. Outside of these allied worthies, however, the Salamanders were regarded as mighty but exceedingly brutal warriors. Fukin's tactics were brutal, aimed at minimizing Imperial losses and achieving quick compliances with little regard for collateral damage, and they worked. In the Battle of Antiem, the first in which the Lord of Drakes fought side by side with his reunited legion, his tactical instincts served him well against the numberless hordes of the orcs. Using fire weaponry and the first of the strange, deadly weapons Fukin had forged after learning the secrets of the Mechanicum, the orcs were slaughtered to the last. With the greenskin menace curtailed, the salamanders quickly pacified this entire region of the Halo stars, destroying several other Xenos threats that had plagued the human worlds of the sector during Old Night. Fukin rejoiced at a task well done, and vowed that he would repeat this success and surpass it in the rest of the crusade. But Fukin failed to realize that, without a pressing threat to make them welcome the Imperium's assistance with open arms, many of the human communities scattered across the galaxy would cling fiercely to their independence. That was the purpose of the Iterators, to convince these reluctant children of Terra to return to her embrace. In Fukin's eyes, however, any who refused to join the Imperium were either ignorant or foolish, and time spent discussing with them was time wasted during which another world's cries for help against galactic dangers went unanswered. His conquests were quick and violent, as he did not hesitate to use whatever means would lead to the enemy's surrender most quickly. While his methods often left the military forces of the worlds brought to compliance in ruins and the ruling class decimated, the salamanders refrained from causing civilian casualties where possible. This was not out of any lingering kindness in their hearts, but a matter of supreme pragmatism. The dead made poor imperial citizens, and butchering civilians often made an enemy's surrender all but impossible. Avenging one's dead family, the salamanders quickly learned, was a cause that would make even the most cowardly of men take up arms and fight to the death without ever considering giving up. The Alliance of Navirian had stood for 6,000 years, surviving through the horrors of the Dark Age of technology and the Age of Strife that followed it. Their fleets and armies had kept their borders safe from alien predations, 12 star systems linked by stable warp routes and united in the name of survival and prosperity. It only took 1 year for the salamanders to reduce the Alliance to ruin. After the failure of the first diplomatic overtures, Fukin decreed that the Alliance's defiance of the Imperium would not be tolerated. Their ships were broken in their world's skies, burning fragments raining upon domed cities. Their armies were crushed on the field of battle, executed to the last as retribution for the few fallen salamanders. World after world fell, their ruling class annihilated and their population cowed in terror as the Legion moved on to the next planet, until at last Fukin's flagship darkened the heavens above the Alliance's capital world. In desperation, the Alliance's leaders attempted diplomacy one last time. I was on the bridge of the Flame Rot when their plea was received, and saw and heard the Primarch's response. These men and women had been broken, shown their insignificance next to the power of the Imperium. They offered their lives in return for their people being spared and their few remaining soldiers being allowed to surrender honorably. Fukin smiled. The most terrifying thing I have ever seen, and I have journeyed through the warp, congratulated them on their moral courage, and agreed to their offer of capitulation. The planet was taken without a single shot. The soldiers of the Alliance were disarmed and sent back to their homes. After a year of rebuilding ruins, the adepts of the Administratum were relieved to finally see a world brought to compliance without the salamanders almost completely destroying its infrastructure first. I never found out what happened to the leaders of the Alliance after they surrendered. From the forbidden account In the Shadow of the Dragons, by Navy officer Torsen Veller. Fukin regarded his more humane brothers as naive, and believed that eventually the rigors of the Great Crusade would bring them to see the galaxy as he did, a harsh and unforgiving place that demanded that the strong rule over the weak. While close to Rogaldorn and Ferrus Manus, who both shared his outlook, he was shunned by the rest of the Primarches, save for Guilliman. The Primarch of the Ultramarines often met with his Nocturnian brother, trying to convince him to change his views with long and passionate debates into the merits of their various approaches to the rest of mankind. These reunions created a bond between them stronger than any Fukin shared with his other brothers, for while he never changed his mind and remained certain that Guilliman would change his in time, he appreciated the fact that Robout was the only one not to have given up on him. The two of them also often discussed one of Fukin's most secret and surprising passions, a deep and true interest for ancient art and history. According to Remembrancers, the collection of the Lord of Drakes was staggering both as scope and quality, hosting relics from all of mankind's eras, from the dark age of technology all the way back to before man first discovered writing. In those days, Fukin was fascinated by the flow of history, though it might all have been a front, to hide his secret research into discovering the traces left by other immortals across the eons. In hindsight, and with knowledge of the secret Fukin tried so hard to hide, though he faced little difficulties, never encountering any foe he could not defeat without resorting to his peculiar gift, the patterns in the Lord of Drake's actions are obvious. Whenever a human world colonized in earlier epochs was discovered in regions he was tasked to conquer, he would always begin with a diplomatic phase, even if such efforts were obviously going to be fruitless. In the case of the monarchy of blood, his insistence that the iterators discuss with the ruling king was downright criminal, as it sent a dozen men and women to certain death. At the time, Fukin claimed that these were the results of his efforts to mend his ways in a fashion more agreeable to his brothers, but the truth has since been revealed by the Inquisition's research. On every such world, Fukin sought to buy time in order to investigate the planet's ancient history, searching for clues of the actions of another immortal such as himself. Whether he found any other perpetual that way is unknown. There are no trace of such a discovery in the records accessible to us, but surely had Fukin succeeded, he would have kept it even more secret than the rest of his shadowy quest. Regardless, Fukin's investigations also yielded a trove of technological lore that he hoarded like the beast of myth he had begun to be compared to. He used this knowledge to craft ever more devastating weapons, placing them aboard the grandest of all his accomplishments, the forged ship Chalice of Fire. Eventually, 200 years after the beginning of the Great Crusade, the Emperor called his primarches to the triumph of Olaner. The master of mankind, noble Horus, stalwart Perturabo and elusive Jagatai had defeated the greatest Orc empire to have ever been encountered, and the Emperor wanted to honor those who had fought there, and through them all soldiers fighting the Great Crusade, human or otherwise. Fukin was there, with a group of his most elite warriors, the Pyre Guard, veterans of the Legion, from the days before Fukin had been found. They took part in the parade, and marched beneath the gaze of the gathered primarches with pride. When the Emperor announced that he was returning to Terra, and taking Magnus with him, while leaving Horus in command of the Great Crusade, Fukin wasn't shocked as much as he was intrigued. The Lord of Drakes had ever suspected his father was keeping secrets from the primarches, just as Fukin himself was keeping secrets from his sons and fathers alike. He attempted to uncover these secrets, believing that they might hold a clue in his own quest for answers. But his every investigation, legal or otherwise, was met with an adamantium wall of failure and the sudden silence of infiltrated agents. Fukin's mood grew sour in response to these repeated failures. His tactics grew increasingly brutal, and even downright cruel on occasion. Soon, the title of Lord of Drakes was replaced by another, whispered fearfully by civilians of the Imperium and soldiers of the Imperial Army alike, the Black Dragon. Tales of entire cities being butchered as punishment for their refusal to bend knee, of grotesque mutilation being visited upon surrendered enemy soldiers to prevent them from ever fighting again, circulated across expeditionary fleets. But it wasn't until Karaton that things came to a head. The leaders of the city-states of Karaton had heard of Fukin's aggression, their own primitive astropaths picking up the screams of nearby systems. These nightmarish visions had painted them an image of the Imperium as a blood-drenched dictatorship, where cruel warlords slaughtered with impunity while a distant emperor let them do as they pleased. After a single diplomatic meeting, on the off chance that the visions had been wrong, or deceitful, Karaton cut all contact with the expeditionary fleet hanging in their system and prepared for war. Fukin ordered the salamanders to land en masse on the planet, and prepared to lay siege and break the cities one by one, forcing the leaders who had so insulted him to watch as he did so. As the first assaults began, however, a new fleet entered the system, much smaller than the salamander's own. Conrad Kurz, the King of the Night, had come, thinking to aid his brother in bringing Karaton peacefully into the Imperium's embrace. Instead, he found a planet at war, and sent his Night Lords into the fray. Ostensibly, this was to help the salamanders, but in truth, the savior of Nostramo had dark suspicions regarding his brother, though even his worst fears would fall short of the reality. With the help of the Night Lords, the salamanders quickly took the first of the city-states, only for Fukin to order that 1/5 of the population be executed. Whether civilian, soldier, rich or poor, young or old, 1 out of every 5 inhabitant of that city would be killed, to teach the survivors the price of opposing the Imperium in general, and Fukin in particular. Kurz's rage and horror when he learned the news were terrible, and only the fact that he was on the other side of the planet prevented him from physically attacking Fukin as he would do with Dorn soon after. Instead, after his pleas for stopping were ignored, the King of the Night withdrew his forces from the campaign, taking with him the entire population of the last city-state that still stood unbroken. "Are you mad, brother? What purpose could such slaughter of innocent possibly serve?" Do you so thirst for domination that you care not how many lives you crush? I swear that if you do not stop this insanity immediately, me and every single one of my sons shall not rest until our father's wrath comes down upon you for your crimes. Attributed to Primarch Conrad Kurz, during the Karaton incident. After the events of Karaton, Kurz sent a report on what had happened to the Council of Terra, including recorded evidence of the Salamander's excessive behavior, not just on that world, but in numerous other operations. However, the message was subject to the usual vagaries of the warp, and it took years for actual action to be taken. The reply, when it came, bore the sigil of Malkador himself. It demanded that Fukin and his sons return to Terra to explain their actions, both in the Karaton affair and in the many other instances of excessive force that had happened during the Great Crusade. Kurz sent 10 of his warriors to the Lord of Drakes to carry the Sigilites' message. Nothing was ever heard again of these envoys, for soon after their departure, news of Guilliman's treachery reached the Imperium, and the Salamander's transgressions lost their importance in light of this new heresy. 10 sons of Nostramo laid in pieces across Fukin's throne room when Ardellus Numian crossed the threshold. The Lord of Drakes sat on his throne, eyes fixed upon the carnage his weapon, Dawnbringer, had wrought. The massive, ornate warhammer rested at the side of the throne, still covered in the lifeblood of the legionaries it had torn to fragments. Ardellus walked through the carnage cautiously, eyes fixed on his Primarch, searching for signs that his rage hadn't yet abated. When the 8th Legion small ship had emerged in system and the Night Lords had demanded an audience with Fukin, the Lord of Drakes had been amused if anything, and he had welcomed them aboard his ship, the Flame-wrought. Then the Night Lords had asked that all Salamanders leave the room while they delivered their message to Fukin alone, hinting at the authority behind their orders. Fukin had grown more agitated then, but had agreed to the demands. That had been 9 hours ago, as long as Ardellus dared to wait before returning into the room. "Rouse the astropaths," said the Primarch at last, turning from the bloody scene to his first captain. "I think it's time I answer Guilliman's invitation. Heresy, conquest and secrets. I suppose out of all of them, Fukin turning traitor should have surprised us least. He was always the most brutal, the most ruthless and unrelenting in his approach to conquest. But we were all brutal in our own way, and we had all been ruthless and unwilling to compromise our ideals. This is what it meant to be a Primarch in the first place, to be one of the genetically forged generals of mankind. And there is another thing that scholars and historians will fail to understand: any of our brothers turning against the Imperium in the first place was supposed to be impossible. We couldn't conceive it, or at least, I could not. Until the very last moment, when my boots landed on the black sands of Istvan V and the sounds of my brother's legions firing upon my sons reached my ears, the betrayal of Guilliman, Dorn, Ferris, and Sanguinius felt more like a nightmare more than a reality. How could they not have seen it coming? Generations will cry as they learn of the horrors of this war. How could they let this happen? They were our brothers. We fought and bled at their side, we saved their lives and they saved ours. The true question is, how could we possibly have seen it coming? If treachery did not hurt so much, it wouldn't be nearly as effective. If evil wasn't so unthinkable, it wouldn't be evil. From the private memoirs of Primarch Mortarion, written during the Roboutian Heresy. While the treachery of the Salamanders might seem obvious in hindsight, there is actually very little hard evidence as to the exact means by which Guilliman convinced Fukin to join him in rebellion against their father. There does not seem to have been any attempts by the ruinous powers to court his attention prior to the events of Istvan. His search for other perpetuals might have caused him to research ancient sorcery, but from the records of his investigations, it seems Fukin was, at the time of the Great Crusade, still enough of a believer in the imperial truth that he steered off such dangerous matters. All we have, then, are theories and suspicions. The most probable cause of Fukin's treachery is that, after learning of his coming censure, he was approached by Guilliman, who told him the same lies about the Emperor he had been told himself. Knowing that war was coming to the Imperium and eager to escape the consequences of his crimes, the Black Dragon then willingly joined forces with Robout. Or perhaps it was whatever passed for brotherly love in Fukin's heart that convinced him to side with the one brother he was truly close to, no matter the risks. Another theory is that Fukin knew that the Dark Gods had bestowed strange and previously unknown lore upon Guilliman and his cohorts, and that he believed that this lore held the keys to his long obsession of understanding his own immortality. Regardless of the truth, Fukin came to the Istvan system to help Guilliman's cause, while still draped in the pretenses of loyalty to the emperor. During the journey, his legion's ranks were culled of those who would not follow their primarch in betrayal, in a quick and silent purge. Then came the assault on the traitor's position. Fukin was assigned as part of the second wave, supposed to follow in the wake of the Night Lords, Death Guard and Alpha Legion to secure their gains and crush the rebels with overwhelming force. The testimonies of Istvan survivors indicate that the Salamanders bore no obvious sign of warp-born corruption, such as the Ultramarines and Iron Hands displayed. The librarians of the Salamanders showed no unholy powers on the black sands of the Urgal Plateau, only the natural proficiency with pyromancy that had been their hallmark during the Great Crusade. The single difference was that the sons of Fukin were now using their skills and tactics against their own cousins. Fukin fought against Conrad Kurz there, when the King of the Night willingly sacrificed himself so that his brothers and their sons might escape Guilliman's trap. The Black Dragon, for all his power, was no match against the unleashed fury of Kurz, who had finally let loose his darkest abilities, secure in the knowledge he would be dead long before they could turn him into a monster. Time and again did the King of the Night slay his brother, only for Fukin to rise, his immortality finally revealed to both his sons and the other traitor legions. The secret of the Black Dragon was out in the open at last, and it is likely that Fukin felt relieved at this grand revelation. Finally, Fukin struck Kurz down, the Primarch's body falling in the hands of Salamanders who promptly plundered it for trophies, before being pushed back by the vengeful Night Guard, led by Talos Valkyrin. The Soul Hunter directed his brothers, and they reclaimed the body of their father while Fukin was still reeling from the mental exhaustion of his many resurrections. Soon the massacre was over, and the other traitor Primarchs started to look upon Fukin with mixed respect and fear, wondering how it was that their brother had gained such a powerful gift. The Black Dragon replied to inquiries on that subject only with cold, deadly silence, and soon the traitor legions were convinced that his immortality was the result of some dark pact of his own past with the newly discovered gods of the warp. His brother was dead, and he had been the one to kill him. When Dawnbringer had fallen upon Kurz's chest and blasted his hearts to pieces, Fukin had still believed, deep within, that he was not the only one of his brothers that could not die. None of the Primarchs had ever died before, after all, if you didn't believe in the rumors whispered about the Sixth and their secret campaigns. Only when he had seen his brother's corpse had Fukin realized that he had believed Kurz would rise again, suddenly aware of the folly of it all, understanding the meaninglessness of other, mortal lives, and embracing Fukin as his brother. But instead Conrad had remained dead, staring at him with eyes that, even in death, judged him and condemned him. That had been why he had stepped back, why he had done nothing as the Night Lords killed his sons and took Conrad's body with them. For the first time in his life, he had felt horror and regret. In his chambers aboard the Flame Rot, Fukin brooded on these dark thoughts, ignoring the summons of Guilliman that he attend the war council that would decide the next stage of the war. He was staring at a fire pit, and it seemed to him as if the shadows cast by its flickering light danced on the walls with malevolent intent, closing in on him from all directions. Then, with a mighty roar, he cast down the fire and rose, before storming out of the chamber, leaving Dawnbringer inside, still covered in the blood of the King of the Night. Never again would Fukin touch the weapon he had forged with his own hands. And never again, he vowed to himself, would he do anything, and regret it afterwards. After Istvan, the Salamanders then spread across the galaxy in several groups led by commanders appointed by Fukin himself. These groups did not join in the push toward Terra led by Guilliman and Manus. Instead, they focused on the conquest of vast swathes of the Imperium, forcing trillions to kneel and swear fealty to the Black Dragon, and through him to Guilliman. Some among the traitor legions began to suspect that Fukin was building a power base more loyal to him than to the rebellion. They feared that in time, Fukin would turn against Guilliman, seeking to rule his own empire. Whether these concerns were warranted is, ultimately irrelevant, but illustrates perfectly the distrust and corruption of loyalty that infect the traitor legions to this day. While most worlds were no match for the power of the 18th Legion, the defenders of worlds loyal to the throne world were not without allies. The Night Lords and Alpha Legion had scattered after the massacre, their warriors vowing to get vengeance on those who had betrayed them. While the bulk of the 8th Legion traveled to the Ultima Segmentum to take part in the Thrumas Crusade, thousands of sons of Nostramo remained to help the resistance. The Salamanders found themselves facing the Night Lord's guerrilla tactics on dozens of worlds, and one of their leaders, Josahal, was even responsible for the loss of the legendary Chalice of Fire, including all the terrible weapons aboard this vessel. The Chalice of Fire. Fukin was as much a blacksmith as he was a warrior, and what few archives have survived of the Great Crusade tell us that he had forged many great and terrible weapons during that time, combining his own keen instincts with the lore he gained from the Mechanicum and the worlds he conquered. When word of his betrayal reached the Imperium, many feared that he would turn these weapons against the worlds of mankind, and what the consequences would be, for these were no mundane tools of destruction, but artifacts of immense power, that even the Salamanders had been reluctant to use during the Great Crusade. All of them had been gathered by Fukin in a ship that itself was one of them, the Chalice of Fire, a vast forged ship armed with the laser array known as the Eye of Fukin. This ship was under the command of the first Salamander Forge Father, Tekel. In the skies above Istvan V, the Chalice was responsible for the destruction of 19 vessels of the loyal legions, blasted to pieces by its weapons. But the lords of the Imperium on Terra were not the only ones aware of the threat posed by Fukin's artifacts. Soon after the massacre, a force of Night Lords struck a great blow against the Salamanders. Led by Josahal, a member of the Circle of Shadows known as the Talon Master, a splinter group of the 8th Legion ambushed the Chalice of Fire while it was traveling under light escort deep in traitor space. The Chalice was too powerful for Sahal's flotilla to destroy in the void, and so the Talon Master and his warriors boarded it instead, sacrificing most of their ships in order to do so. According to what little information is available to us, there was some dissent in the ranks of Sahal's group. Some warriors wanted to destroy the Chalice and deny the traitors the use of its contents, while others wanted to make use of the weapons themselves to avenge the loss of their Primarch and help win the war against Guilliman and his allies. Sahal's own opinion on the matter is unknown, and will likely remain so for all time, for as the Night Lords were fighting the Salamanders aboard the Chalice, a new player appeared in the space battle. A fleet of Eldar vessels emerged from the webway, surrounding the Chalice. The Xenos ships took heavy damage from the Forge ships' escorts, but they ignored their losses, focusing on allowing a few ships from reaching their allotted positions around the Chalice. Once these ships were in alignment, just as Josahal was confronting Tekel on the Chalice's bridge, the Eldar used their strange sorcery and ancient technology to banish the Forge ship and its contents into the warp, sealing it away in a stasis bubble of prodigious size. The Eldar vessels then promptly departed, as did the surviving Night Lords' ships, carrying word of this strange battle back to the Loyalists. Eventually, though Josahal and many other warriors had been lost, Savader deemed the attack a success. The Chalice of Fire was never seen again, and the threat of Fukin's artifacts appeared to have been removed from the equation of civil war. Great was the rage of Fukin when he learned the fate of his forged ship and the loss of his weapons. He vowed that the Eldar would pay for their treachery, and over the millennia since, he has made good on that promise several times, sending warbands to attack Exodite planets and even craft worlds, and allying with the Blood Angels on several occasions. Still, the children of Isha remain confident that they did the right thing. The artifacts forged by the Black Dragon in the time he was still flesh and blood were far too dangerous to be left in the hands of monkeys. Yet the question remains, the Chalice of Fire was not destroyed, merely sealed away. Even now, there are many Forge Fathers and other Chaos Lords who seek to break its prison and bring it back to the Materium so that they might plunder its contents. Some factions among the Mechanikus that are aware of the Forge ship's legend are also hungry for the lost lore it contains, convinced that since it was sealed before the Salamanders succumbed to the lure of chaos, all its treasures rightfully belong to the Omniscia as devoted servants. The Inquisition is ever watchful for signs of this dread ship's return, and its agents know that, should the Chalice reappears, they can count on the help of the Night Lords. The sons of Nostramo are as eager to prevent the horrors the Chalice could unleash as they are to learn more about the fate of their brothers lost to its holds 10,000 years ago, perhaps even now, in a place out of time. Josahal battles Tekel still. Many among the Shattered Legions sought vengeance against the Primarches who had personally led the slaughter of their brothers, and none more so than the Night Lords against Fukin. Many plots were hatched to eliminate the Black Dragon, only to be aborted when the realization sunk in that none of them had the means to prevent Fukin's unholy resurrection. That is, none of them, until the chief librarian of the 8th Legion, the Terran-born Felzerost, was contacted by a man calling himself John Grammaticus. Grammaticus was a perpetual, something he proved to the librarian by allowing himself to be killed in front of him. Painful as the process was, it, along with the 20th Legion medallion found in Grammaticus' possession, convinced Zoroast to listen to what this immortal had to say. The tale he received is preserved in the archives of the Night Lords as well as those of the Inquisition, who received a copy soon after its founding. According to Grammaticus, he had once been in the employ of a group of Xenos from various species interested in manipulating the human race to their own ends. Their enemy was the Primordial Annihilator, the dark force in the warp that had corrupted and empowered Guilliman and his associates. But this cabal, as it called itself, was no ally of the Imperium. It wanted the traitors to win so that Guilliman would eventually destroy mankind, taking the Primordial Annihilator along with it. Grammaticus' desertion was, he said, a tale for another time, for he brought knowledge far more important to Zoroast's immediate needs, a mean to kill Fukin, permanently. Before departing the Cabal, John had learned of an artifact called the Fulgurite Spear, a weapon made of the psychic remnant of the Emperor's own power. Lost and forgotten on an isolated world decades ago, this weapon had been prophesied by one of the Eldar's seers to be able to end the life of the Black Dragon. Grammaticus claimed that of all the traitor primarchs, Fukin was somehow the most dangerous, and that if he were not stopped he would, in time, become the most terrible threat to all sentient life in the galaxy. Zoroast needed little convincing to go after the Fulgurite, his own hatred of the fallen Lord of Drakes making all other considerations secondary. The Fulgurite rested on the world of Traurus. According to local legends, the Emperor had traveled to this world long before he had revealed himself on Terra and begun the Wars of Unification. There, he had battled a coven of daemons, sorcerers, and their minions. Such had been the power unleashed there that the Fulgurite Spear had formed from the remaining energies of the Master of Mankind's psychic lightning. The relic had been recovered by an illegal and secret cult of the Emperor as a god, enshrined and preserved for decades. The Dark Gods, however, were also aware of the Fulgurite and the threat it represented to their minions, for as a relic from the Emperor, it was anathema to all creatures of chaos. They had told their devotees among the traitor legions of the weapon resting on Traurus, and when Grammaticus and Zoroast arrived on the planet, it was already occupied by Dark Angel's forces. The population had been either exterminated, sacrificed in dark rituals to the Changer of Ways, or shipped off-world to the nightmarish laboratories the First Legion had hidden in the Ghoul Stars. Yet the First Legion was still present, searching for the Fulgurite. The last act of resistance of Traurus people had been to hide their sacred relic. Together with a small group of Night Lords, Grammaticus and Zoroast infiltrated the Dark Angel's lines, using the powers of the Chief Librarian in combination with the Perpetual's own strange psychic powers. After a brief battle against the Dark Angel sorcerer leading the traitors on Traurus, they managed to recover the Fulgurite Spear and escape. Immediately, Zoroast began to prepare a way for them to get to Fukin, not an easy task, even for the 8th Legion. The Night Lords were too scattered for a full-front assault, and the Chief Librarian was unwilling to gamble the lives of his brothers on what was, after all, only the word of one human with a strange ability. Even Grammaticus agreed that a direct attack was likely to fail, as Fukin was leading the core group of the 18th Legion. Cunning, he said, would be their best chance at succeeding. Using secret knowledge gleaned during his time as an agent of the Cabal, Grammaticus and Zoroast infiltrated the Salamander's flagship, the Flame Rot. The two of them went there alone, for to keep themselves hidden from perception would require all of their combined efforts. We do not know the exact details of what happened, for John Grammaticus was never seen again, and the headless corpse of the Chief Librarian was displayed as a standard by the Salamanders when they next fought against the 8th Legion. We know, however, that Grammaticus managed to reach Fukin and hurt him with the Fulgurite. While Fukin survived the attack, he was still wounded, and the damage did not heal as it should have. Unsure of what the consequences would be should he die again while the Fulgurite's wound was still on his flesh, Fukin was forced to turn toward the dark arts his brothers had so fully embraced. A grand ritual was performed, that cost the lives of thousands of sacrifices and shattered the sanity of dozens of librarians, turning them into full-fledged sorcerers. Through it, Fukin was able to contact the Dark Gods themselves, and have them heal the damage inflicted upon him by John Grammaticus. But the ruinous powers never give anything without hidden costs, and Fukin's soul was forever tainted by the ritual, with his every night haunted by visions of horror and corruption, as the Chaos Gods each attempted to draw him to their service. How long had it been, Fukin wondered, since he had last truly felt pain? When he had fought against Kurz, he had died many times, but none of those deaths had felt as painful as the pulsing agony in his flank. Every wound he had suffered then had quickly been healed when he had resurrected, for the King of the Night had been trying to kill him quickly, not make him suffer, another proof of his weakness. The Black Dragon was still furious that one of the would-be assassins had managed to escape. He had slain the Night Lord Librarian, cutting his head off with the nameless blade he had forged after abandoning Dawnbringer, but the accursed human, the one who had actually carried the stemmed spear point, had fled before he could catch him. One of his sons had been sure that he had shot the man, but there had been no body when they had reached the location of his supposed death, though there was quite a lot of blood, too much for one mortal to lose without dying. This brought dark possibilities to mind for Fukin, but he disregarded them, for he had more pressing concerns. He was standing in the middle of what had once been a prosperous hive city, but was now little more than a graveyard haunted by the tormented ghosts of its former inhabitants. Millions had been sacrificed in patterns gleaned from the occult lore Fukin had accumulated in his search for answers and from the other renegade legions. Around him stood a circle of 144 librarians, their lips silently moving as they mentally recited incantations of Fukin's own design, based on scrolls plundered from the vaults of a Xenos species he had personally all but exterminated. A few had escaped him, but regardless of what lore they had managed to flee with, Fukin was confident that the Sarutha would never again threaten mankind. The air shimmered with barely contained power. Then, a crack appeared in the very fabric of the universe, then spread, until reality shattered and the layer behind the Materium was revealed. Fukin looked right into it, and as the incantations continued, now shouted loudly, in voices that seemed to be more than a little hysterical, shapes began to form in the roaring maelstrom. 4 great silhouettes that were actually one, that were actually a trillion souls scattered across the entire galaxy, looking down at Fukin with eyes filled with all the malevolence of the universe. At that moment, Fukin understood the true nature of chaos. He saw what Gilliman had seen in the Eye of Terror, the power of the primordial annihilator and its connection with every human who had ever lived or would ever live. He saw the true nature of mankind looking at him through the masks of the ruinous powers. They are us, he thought, cold horror filling his mind at the dawning revelation. These gods, they are us. He felt his sanity tremble, and for a moment he teetered on the brink of the abyss of madness, about to fall and embrace the worship of chaos as so many had before him. Countless souls had come to this revelation before him, each broken and reforged into a weapon of the dark gods. Before the knowledge that an evil of such scope existed, that it came from and rested into the depths of the human soul, scholars, philosophers, savants, and psychers had all been consumed by madness. But not him. As the Black Dragon was confronted with his own insignificance in the grand scheme of things, he did not weep, nor did he break. "I am no one's slave," he growled, clinging to his own identity and desires. "I will not serve. I will not kneel. Never." The only reply from the storm of ruin was a terrible laughter, filled with dreadful indulgence and the inevitability of damnation. "I call upon all the powers of the beyond," Fukin shouted in the very face of insanity. "The price has been paid in blood and souls. Heal me from this curse, and restore my full might." The entities around, above, beneath, and within him laughed even louder, and reached out. Soon after the assassination attempt, Fukin turned his eyes toward a distant planet, in the Segmentum Tempestus. This world had nothing of worth about it, save that it had served as a staging ground for the Great Crusade and likely contained resources left behind by the many forces that had used it over the decades. It was known as Talern, and in the nightmarish visions sent by the dark gods to torment him, Fukin had learned a secret that the ruinous powers had likely attempted to keep a secret from him. Beneath the surface of Talern was buried an artifact of prodigious dark power. One that, in the right hands, could be used to defeat the dark gods themselves, the curses of Alganar, one of the 3 gateways of the gods. This warp vortex could grant those strong enough to master it, few as they were in the galaxy, control over the energies of the Empyrean, and dominion over its denizens. The salamanders came to Talern in force, and the war began with a viral bombarding of the entire planet. Fukin had no desire to waste time by prosecuting a traditional war. He had come to Talern for one reason only, and the world's resources and inhabitants played no part in it. Some of the people of Talern were able to find shelter in the great sealed vaults that had been used to store the equipment left behind by the Great Crusade, but the environment was ravaged, a once verdant world transformed into a desert of radioactive sandstorms. The salamanders' resilience to radiation allowed them to walk on the surface while only wearing power armor, but for the human survivors, travel was only possible in armored vehicles, and even then only for a short period at a time. Fortunately, the vaults held plenty of tanks in various states of repair, and soon, the Talern rose once more, determined to avenge their world. Thousands of tanks rolled toward the traitor positions, and despite the clouds of dust, they were visible from orbit long enough before making contact that the salamanders had time to prepare. Still, Fukin had not anticipated such resistance. He had believed that only a handful of terrified civilians dwelled in the vaults. The Battle of Talern began as a gigantic clash of tanks amidst the ashes of the world, and things only escalated from here. The loyalists on Talern managed to send an astropathic call, and soon reinforcements from both sides poured onto Talern. The soldiers of the Emperor who came to Talern did not know why the planet was so important. All that mattered was that the traitors wanted it enough for a Primarch to direct operations, and therefore it must be denied them. Imperial army regiments, knights, and even titans were deployed. The skies above Talern were filled with light for the first time since the bombardment as the brilliance of orbital battles pierced the dust cloud. Even warbands from other traitor legions arrived, drawn by the promise of a glorious battle. Groups from the White Scars, Space Wolves, and Imperial Fists were welcomed by Fukin, but kept away from his real reason for being on Talern. For months, the battle raged on. Eventually, however, the Loyalists started to gain ground, thanks to a few decisive operations of infiltration and sabotage by the Alpha Legion that led to a final, decisive engagement. According to the surviving accounts, almost 1 million tanks and other heavy vehicles were involved in this last confrontation. Through countless acts of heroism and self-sacrifice, the Loyalists won the day, taking heavy casualties, but still able to continue their advance toward Fukin's fortresses. Though he still had thousands of legionaries at his disposal, fighting tanks and titans with Astaroths was a foolish notion. And so, at long last, Fukin was forced off the planet by the combined power of the Loyalist forces, forced to abandon the ongoing excavation of the Cursus. The War of Talern was over, but the planet would not know peace for long. Years after the end of the heresy, the ancient evil buried beneath its surface was finally unearthed. This was done not by the hands of traitors, but by unaware miners, and the price paid in blood was terrible, though the threat was stopped in the end. This conflict, known as the Cursus War in what few archives are allowed to speak of it, would also see the Imperium forced to ally with the Eldars in order to stop an evil born of the old follies of this ancient Xenos race. As the Salamander's fleet departed, an astropathic call came from Guilliman, spurred through the warp storm by the fell sorcery of the 13th Legion. After years of painstaking advance, the Ultramarines and Iron Hands had carved the path to Terra open. The arch-traitor was preparing for the final assault on the throne world, and he was calling all of his brothers in treachery to his side. Fuming with the sting of defeat and the knowledge that the power buried beneath the surface of Talern would never be his, for he knew that the Dark Gods would never allow him a second chance at securing something that could make him a threat to them, Fukin ordered his fleet to begin the journey to Terra. He would yet see the Imperium fall, and be reborn again in a new, strong, immortal form. Cold and darkness had held him for so long that when they receded at last, it took him a moment to realize that he wasn't dead. It took him even longer to remember what had happened, and when he did, he wished he had not. Xaven, captain of the 34th Company of the Salamanders, remembered the numbness he had felt when the transmission had reached his ship, during the journey to Istvan. He remembered the horror that had soaked his soul as he understood its implications. He remembered the burning hatred and fury that had driven him on the very edge of insanity. Then he remembered the betrayal among his own men, how they had fought one another in the corridors of the ship, torn between those who were willing to follow their Primarch's every order and those who refused to abide his madness. Xaven remembered marching down the shadowed iron tunnels, stalking his own kind like a beast of Nocturnian legends. He remembered the smell of his brother's blood as he killed them, remembered the fear and terror of the crew members who had looked upon him in the throes of his fury. He remembered the final confrontation with the turncoats' leader, in the vessel's enginarium. He remembered the stray shot that had shattered a conduit to the warp core, the shriek of the alarms, the ship dropping out of the Empyrean with such violence that it had fallen apart, the infinite blackness of space spread all around him as he floated helplessly, trapped in his sealed armor, condemned to watch the power and oxygen levels steadily dropping. He forced his eyes open, and saw a figure standing before him. His vision was blurry, but he recognized the silhouette of another Asteroutes, though he did not know the colors he wore, gray, but not like that worn by the word-bearers. This warrior's armor shone with a light that only partially belonged to the material universe. In the crimson eyes of Xaven, it seemed that the armor was imbued with some otherworldly light that soothed the torment of his soul. Who? His voice croaked out of his throat, and the pain of speaking was like tearing his vocal cords apart. Who are you? My name is Alexis Pollux, loyal servant of the Emperor. I have come to bring you home. The Siege of Terra. And while the arch-traitor marched his legions to confront the father he had betrayed, the Lord of Drakes led his sons against the noble houses of Terra, leaving naught but ruin in his wake. With fire and hatred they came, burning all that stood in their path to ashes and drenching Terra's soil with the blood of heroes. And they cast down the doors of mankind's ancestral home, seeking to plunder her treasures for themselves, heedless of the destruction they left in their wake. Excerpt from the Canticle of the Dead. While most imperial records of the Siege of Terra focus on the battles raging around and within the imperial palace, the siege was actually waged all across the surface of the throne world. Though Perturabo had focused all the resources and forces at his disposal in the palace, there were still hive cities housing billions spread all over the planet, defended by the private armies of these cities' rulers. When the traitor fleet reached Terra's orbit, Guilliman tasked the salamanders with the suppression of these remaining armies, so that once he had slain the Emperor their lords would kneel to him and acknowledge him as the new master of mankind. But there was one army that Guilliman knew would never serve him, and needed to be destroyed, the legion of heroes that would come to be known as Dragon's Bane. During the heresy, refugees from the entire Imperium flocked to Terra by the billion, fleeing the horrors inflicted by the traitor legions upon invaded populations. After being vetted by the Iron Warriors and Custodians, a process that sometimes took months, these refugees were allowed to set foot on the throne world. However, for security reasons, the bulk of them was sent away from the imperial palace and onto the lands of America. The lords of the American hives stretched their resources to the limit to accommodate this sudden increase in population, and the flow of supplies from outsystem increased to match. Over the years, these people integrated themselves into the hives, and when it became obvious that the war would come to Terra eventually, many volunteered to fight for their new home world. Several American noble families, fiercely loyal to the throne, nearly bankrupted themselves to arm, equip, and train millions of these volunteers, making them a true military force no inferior to those of the Imperial Army. Driven by the loss of their birth worlds and the desire to protect their families, these men and women trained day and night without complaint. Fears of traitor spies and cultists infiltrating the refugees were laid to rest by the Thousand Sons, who ruthlessly purged such elements, foiling the plot of the arch-traitor to use these poor souls in order to seed confusion and paranoia at the heart of the Imperium. Of all the loyalist forces on Terra not already in the palace, Guilliman feared this army the most, for they had both the means and the will to attack his forces from behind while he was laying siege to the palace. He asked that Fukin himself ensure that they were taken out of the equation, by any means necessary. And so, led by the Black Dragon himself, the primary force of the Salamanders descended upon America. But Fukin had underestimated the amount of resolve an unaugmented human can bring to bear with his back to the wall and his family in danger. What was later called the Battle of Dragon's Bane was a slaughter. Millions of human soldiers fought and died heroically against the forces of the 18th Legion. For months they resisted, giving their lives to hold back the tide of transhuman warriors. Ironically, the nobles who had not spent their wealth to assist and arm the refugees were the first to fall, their private armies crushed by the salamanders, hungry for the plunder of their treasure rooms, which, while still full, would not save their lives. Meanwhile, the estates of those who had risked their family's fortune to aid others were defended until death. This battle, where common humans held back the power of nearly an entire Space Marine Legion, is celebrated to this day, with grand monuments built upon the locations of the most important engagements. Many of today's most prominent citizens of America are descended from one of the heroes of this desperate battle. While they were ultimately defeated, the soldiers of Dragon's Bane saved the lives of their kin, for no sooner had he finally succeeded in breaking the army, Fukin's attention turned toward the imperial palace. His forces had already pillaged the only vaults on America still holding any wealth, and the Black Dragon was unwilling to be denied the glory of the final battle, as well as his share of the treasures within the palace. There are some theories that Perturabo deliberately engineered the whole thing to ease the pressure on the palace, personally discussing with American lords and convincing them to bankroll the creation of the refugee army. While there is little evidence, none of which convincing, it is enough to increase the distrust of Terrans for the 4th Legion a little more. Despite the battle's name, the Salamanders' losses weren't very high at Dragon's Bane, thanks to their superior endurance. However, it is still a source of shame to the 18th Legion, and they do all they can to keep it a secret, especially from their own slaves. For should these unfortunate souls learn that their demigod masters aren't as invincible as they claim to be, their hold over them would be quick to shatter. While there was some order to the Salamanders' suppression of any potential second front across Terra, the battle for the Imperial Palace was, on the traitors' side, a barely controlled chaos. The Blood Angels were rampaging in the cities surrounding the palace proper, feeding their unholy appetites upon the defenseless population. The White Scars and Space Wolves, lacking the unifying presence of their primarches, fought in dispersed packs, attaching themselves to other forces or launching daring raids on their own, which were quickly crushed by loyalist counterattacks. As the madness of chaos strengthened its grip over the 9 traitor legions, Fukin himself began to lose control of his sons as well as his own desires. Instead of pursuing tactical objectives, the Salamanders turned their eyes on the vaults of the Imperial Palace, where the relics of mankind's earlier ages and treasures from all over the galaxy were stored. Some of Fukin's sons were disillusioned, mocking the artifacts surrounding them as junk, seeing little of value in it, no gold, no gemstones, only antique trinkets from ages long forgotten. But the Lord of Drakes recognized both the artistry of the items gathered here and the subtle power of their historical significance. Here were relics that, for all their apparent lack of immediate value, were tied tightly to mankind's very nature. Each marked a step, an accomplishment of a fledgling species on the long and tortuous path that had led it to galactic supremacy. There was a portrait of a woman with the most mysterious smile, and a stele covered in 3 different alphabets, the characters barely visible after tens of thousands of years. A painting of yellow flowers hang in a stasis field, and dozens of other items were similarly preserved. Surrounded by these items of mankind's ancestral past, Fukin felt at peace. The ravenous hunger that had been burning in his breast ever since he had made that ill-fated deal with the Empyrean in order to recover from the assassination attempt had ceased to torment him. Then that peace was shattered. "My lord," said Artelis suddenly, breaking Fukin's contemplation. The commander of the Pyre Guard was gesturing at his vox. "Listen." Repressing a violent response to his equerry's disturbance, Fukin shifted his vox frequency and listened into the announcement, just in time to catch the last words. "We have come for you." A cold feeling that was very much like doubt spread through his guts. He knew those words, and he knew the voice speaking them, distorted and uglier though it may be. But it was impossible that he be here. Guilliman had told him of the schemes their warp-born allies had engineered to ensure he was unable to interfere. And yet... "It's confirmed, my lord," shouted Artelis. "The 3rd and 8th have arrived. Lord Guilliman demand that we hold them back while Lord Corax fights them in orbit and he and the others push in for the final assault." Fukin cursed silently, and looked around one last time. So many treasures, so much knowledge, so much power. The kind of power his siblings would either fail to notice or, in the case of those who had fully succumbed to the attraction of the ruinous powers, would seek to destroy in order to plunge mankind further into ignorant worship of these primordial entities. He would not allow such a thing. Guilliman and him, as well as the others who still clung to their sanity, would lead mankind to greatness under their rule, not reduce it to barbarism and madness. Order would come from their strength, whatever the will of the self-proclaimed dark gods. So had Guilliman promised him. "Leave them," he ordered to his men as he turned back the way he had come, out of the Sigilites' private quarters and back to the field outside the palace. "Touch nothing. We will return here once our work outside is done, and before anyone else gets here." It is said that when the Night Lords and Emperor's children arrived and Sanguinius was destroyed, Fukin was marching through the private collection of the Sigillite, looking over relics from old Earth with eyes burning with greed. He immediately left the palace, taking some of the priceless artifacts with him, now irredeemably tainted by the touch of the warp, and prepared his forces to face the 3rd and 8th Legions' reinforcements on the surface of Terra. He believed that the Night Lords would stop at nothing to get a chance at him, and looked forward to sending them to meet their Primarch in the afterlife. He was wrong. Savator's hold on his brothers was strong, forged during the heresy by regular strikes of genius and inspiration that had saved the Legion several times and brought them to the siege in time to play a part in the last stage of the war. The Night Lords remained focused on their task, saving countless civilians from the Blood Angels while Fukin uselessly awaited their charge. Eventually, the Salamanders abandoned their defensive positions and attacked the Night Lords themselves, but the Sons of Nostramo had the edge in urban warfare, and the ruins of Terra's cities proved a suitable killing ground for them. While not too many Salamanders were slain before the siege came to an end, virtually no Night Lords were lost, save for those unfortunate enough to face the Black Dragon himself. Because of this, Guilliman was forced to launch his final assault on the Cavia Ferrum without the support of the Black Dragon, whose presence would certainly have made things turn out much differently. When the arch-traitor fell at the Emperor's hands, Fukin was among the first traitor Primarches to order his legion to run. In the eyes of the Black Dragon, he had fulfilled his part in the siege the moment Dragon's Bane had ended. Guilliman had proved unworthy when he had failed in his. Whatever the future would bring, Fukin refused to face it as an animal caged by his brothers once they realized they could not execute him. His fleet left Terra united under his leadership, and it would prove to be one of the most dangerous threats to the Imperium yet. Post-heresy, the Dragon Ascendant. In the fires of a war greater than any before he rises, reborn. A creature not of emotions but dark desires and fell ambition. Waiting for the day he lays claim to the first and last blade. And becomes the one even the gods shall fear. Attributed to the broken devotee. The demise of Guilliman did not signal the end of the war for Fukin, it only changed how he chose to prosecute it. The drive for conquest that had inhabited the Salamanders during the heresy vanished, replaced by a level of greed no one would have thought a Primarch and his legion could be capable of. The 18th Legion, come together again under Fukin's command for the siege of Terra, rampaged across the galaxy, plundering hundreds of worlds like an unstoppable force of nature. Yet even as his fleet's holds were filled with treasure, Fukin's greed was not satisfied. A deep, dark hunger had formed at the core of his being, born of the emptiness that had come in the wake of Guilliman's death and the loss of Fukin's purpose. Destiny is the justification of tyrants and the excuse of fools. Ancient Terran proverb. As the Black Dragon committed atrocity after atrocity, that void began to fill with the energies of the warp. No single dark god bestowed his twisted blessings upon Fukin, the hollowness of his spirit simply called to the flows of the Sea of Souls. Fukin's powers grew, and at long last, he found a new purpose, to become something more than even his father had planned, to shed the last part of himself that remained human and become a true immortal, freed from the limitations his current body imposed upon him. At this point, Lionel Johnson and Sanguinius had both already become Daemon Primarches, and Fukin intended to follow their example, except that he did not intend to bend knee to any of the four. So began the War of the Dragon, fueled by Fukin's renewed ambition. The Salamanders slowed their wild course across the galaxy, letting the Imperial pursuit catch up to them. As could have been expected, the Night Lords were leading the charge, burning with the desire to avenge the murder of Conrad Kurz. But though the Night Lords and their allies outnumbered the Salamanders, who had lost almost all of their human supports during the siege of Terra and the desperate flight from it, it was all part of the Black Dragon's plan. Fukin had learned from the siege of Terra that his mere presence would not be enough to goad the Night Lords into reckless actions, and so he had designed another way. At his command, thousands of astropaths were tortured while made to watch the relics Fukin had stolen from his brother's corpse on Istvan V. The relic's image was broadcast into the warp, where it was picked up by the Night Lord's navigators, astropaths, and librarians. Immediately, Savator, Legion Master of the Night Lords and heir of Conrad Kurz, lost control of his brothers. The Nostraman warriors abandoned the Prince of Crow's carefully designed plan of attack and launched themselves into a direct and massed assault. All across the Salamander's territory, thousands of Night Lords died at the hands of the Sons of Fukin, while the sorcerers of the 18th Legion performed a grand ritual at their Primarch's behest. The exact details of the spell have long since been lost to time, if they were ever recorded in Imperial archives, but the end result was clear. In his fortress in the Krith cluster, Fukin shed his body of flesh and became a daemon Primarch. He could hear them all. Billions of voices, crying out in fear and worship of him. Across the galaxy, they knew his name. He was terror and power incarnate to these weaklings, far more than the shadow of his dead brother. He was the one they feared now that their false god had ascended to his golden throne. He drank deep of their fear, feeling it strengthen him. He reached out across the stars and sensed the carnage his sons were wreaking in his name, the fury and helplessness of cursed sons as they rushed into his trap, spurred on by the thirst for revenge. He laughed, and the sound of his laughter would echo across the sea of souls and drive psychers mad for 10,000 years. The souls of the fallen Night Lords cried out as he captured them and burned them out, reducing these noble warriors to nothing more than fuel for his own ambition. His body twisted and cracked, his immortality struggling against the transformation taking hold. He focused all of his will to mastering the power that had returned him to life so many times, bending it into unnatural patterns, forcing it to work alongside the empiric energies rather than against them in an unholy union that perverted everything his father had ever intended. His body grew and grew, swollen with the fear and death and plunder. His armor burst to pieces as his skin was covered in scales, and two immense wings erupted from his back. His sword shattered in 100 fragments that flew across the air, each embedding itself into the flesh of a different sacrifice. Whatever little remained of Fukin's humanity was lost, and the black dragon opened his eyes and looked down at a dead world with burning red eyes, seeing the tiny, green-armored beings before him as sparks of light in the infinite black. He opened his mouth, which was now a jaw that could swallow tanks, and roared his might at the face of the universe. The rise of Fukin sent ripples across the sea of souls, causing cults to appear on dozens of worlds and demonic incursions to tear through reality's veil on several. The Imperium was forced to send more forces to deal with the situation, while the Night Lords themselves were reinforced by allies of the highest caliber, the Sons of Horus, led by the now legendary Mournival. At the same time, the Salamanders, instead of being bolstered by their Primarch's new terrible power, were instead shaken as their command chain was suddenly thrown into chaos. Fukin's mind had undergone a transformation as drastic as his body, though philosophers would argue that in both cases his true nature had simply been revealed. He was still struggling with his new existence, and was unable to properly lead his legion, even as the Imperium struck back with all its strength. With the help of the Sons of Horus, Savator was able to turn the situation, and finally confronted Fukin in the ruins of Krith Prime, once a populous hive world whose people had been sacrificed to fuel the ascension of the Salamander's Primarch. There, amidst the bones of billions of dead, the Prince of Crows and the Mournival faced the Black Dragon. The details of this confrontation are long lost, but it is known that both Savator and the 4 members of the Mournival survived, while Fukin fled through the Sea of Souls, abandoning his sons to imperial retribution. The War of the Dragon was over, and though the Imperium had ultimately been victorious, it had lost much, while a known enemy of mankind became much more powerful. He looked upon them, and for the first time since Guilliman had died, he knew uncertainty. There were thousands of them, charging across the ruins his sons had made of this world, but only 6 deserved his attention, only 6 truly threatened him, their soul fires burning bright across the battlefield. 4 came together, fighting as one as they crashed through the ranks of his sons like a tidal wave. 2 carried the weapons that had broken his brother, the Maul and the Talon. The 2 weapons shone with a light that burned his eyes, even from a great distance. They could hurt him, he knew, perhaps even kill him. Was he truly immortal now? Had his gift endured the transformation? And even if it had, did it have the power to save him from weapons such as these? He knew that those like him could be destroyed, by weapons imbued with particular power. Several such tools of death had been aboard the Chalice of Fire before it had been stolen from him. Then there were the 2 others, the sons of the King of the Night. One was shining with the light of power long denied, now embraced in full, and moved like a meteor, striking too quick for his sons to even stand a chance to stop him. And the last one. The last one was cloaked in shadows too deep for even his sight to penetrate, and all that radiated from him was vengeance and the cold promise of death. The 6 came down on him in a circle, and for the first time since his beast mother had killed him hundreds of years ago, Fukin knew fear. He had gone too far, sacrificed too much, to be stopped now. With a roar, he gathered his power and tore through the veil of space, before plunging into the rift. His sons closest to him rushed in to follow him, exposing themselves to the raw madness of the warp in order to remain with their Primarch. As he fled from Krith, Fukin convinced himself that there had been no reason to remain there. He had achieved his goal and claimed the power that was rightfully his. Now he sensed another opportunity in the distance, something that would allow him to finish the war and claim the throne Guilliman had failed to seize. The Black Dragon did not see the Shadow Knight who entered the rift behind him, just before it closed. He did not see the lone warrior who stalked him across the sea of souls, shades, and echoes gathered around him, driven forward by the promise of vengeance. The hunt would last many hundreds of years. But eventually, the Soul Hunter and the Black Dragon would meet again, and judgment would come at last. Soon after the end of the War of the Dragon, the Night Lords destroyed Nocturne, using cyclonic torpedoes to literally tear the entire planet to shreds. Prometheus, the planet's moon, crashed into the surface of Nocturne during the upheaval, and fragments of both celestial bodies still form an asteroid belt in the system this day. It was hoped that this act would draw Fukin out of hiding and make him confront the Night Lords to avenge his destroyed home world. But the Black Dragon had long since left Nocturne behind him, and just as the volcanic planet burst into fragments, he instead emerged from the warp in the Pandorax system, on the thrice-cursed world of Pythos. A legion of daemons walked in his wake, as well as a handful of salamanders, reforged through the fires of the Empyrean into Second-born, possessed marines of immense power. Before him stood the Death Guards and the Thousand Sons, each led by their Primarch, as well as many imperial regiments. They had come to Pythos to seal a warp rift of immense size, through which the hordes of the Neverborn were pouring into real space. Fukin and his followers passed through that rift as Magnus was gathering his power to close it. It is unknown whether Fukin knew of the Pythos rift when he fled from Krith, or if he was lost in the warp, was guided by the dark gods to the portal, and seized the opportunity it presented. Had Fukin triumphed on Pythos, he would have been able to open a new front against the Imperium, and perhaps even win the war that Guilliman had started. But first, the Black Dragon had to face one of his brothers for the second time. The fight between Mortarion and Fukin is the stuff of legends, and recorded in the archives of the Inquisition and the 14th and 15th Legions alike. It is written that though Fukin towered above the Death Lord in his new infernal form, Mortarion was undaunted, and faced his fallen brother head-on, wielding the scythe with which he had cleansed his world of the Witch Lords. The weapon was the bane of all those corrupted by the warp, and Fukin was no exception. But Mortarion was already weary and wounded, brought near the end of his nearly infinite endurance by the days of fighting through the jungles of Pythos, while Fukin had been reinvigorated by his journey through the warp. In the end, Mortarion fell before the Black Dragon's claws, but not before inflicting a terrible wound upon Fukin's flank. The injury was grave enough that when Magnus unleashed the spell he had been preparing during the fight between the two Primarches, the Black Dragon was unable to resist its purifying power. Fukin lost his hold upon his material form and was banished into the Sea of Souls, able only to scream in denial as Magnus sealed the warp rift and thwarted his dark ambitions. Fukin's defeat at Magnus' hands was not permanent, however. After the Black Dragon's endless resurrections on Istvan V, the fact that he had disappeared after the Crimson King defeated him had led some to hope that he had been banished forever, but that was not to be. Soon, the seers of the Thousand Sons saw visions of the great drake rising from a sea of flames within the Eye of Terror. Fukin had returned, though his flank still bore the mark of Mortarion's scythe. The sorcerers of the Salamanders also felt their Primarch's return, and guided the entire legion into the Great Eye and toward their master. There, the legion was reunited, but Fukin's new, titanic aspect and terrible aura made it impossible for all but the strongest of his sons to even stand in his presence. In shedding the last of his human weaknesses, Fukin had also lost his connection with his own sons. Now, though they feared him and worshipped him, they could no longer love him, for he was as alien to them as the dark gods themselves. Great was the rage of Fukin as he realized that he had lost so much more than he had been prepared to sacrifice. The ground of the Legion's new demonic homeworld shook with his fury for the greater part of a century beyond the Eye, and the Salamanders spent most of the Legion wars fighting for survival, their master lost to the tides of his insane wrath. Many sold their services to one side or the other of the wars raging in the Eye of Terror, and when the Clone Wars erupted, they added their forces to those pouring through the shattered iron cage. Without a Primarch to give them cohesion, however, these salamander warbands who took advantage of Bile's insanity were soon forced back into the Eye by a vengeful strike of the Night Lords. Among the ranks of the Lost and the Damned, whispers circulated that the salamanders would soon be an extinct legion, left behind by a Primarch who had abandoned them. Ardellus Numian, the Broken Devotee. Like most legions, the salamanders' cadre of Terminators were gathered in a single brotherhood, whose members were spread across companies. In the salamanders' case, this group was the first company, known as the Pyre Guard. During the Roboutian Heresy, it was led by Ardellus Numian, first captain of the 18th Legion and equerry of Fukin. A Terran legionary and one of the few survivors of the time before the Legion was reunited with its Primarch, Ardellus was a powerful warrior and an inspiring leader, something of a rarity in the 18th Legion. Fukin recognized his use when he took command, and named Ardellus his equerry, tasked with interceding between the Lord of Drakes and the rest of the Imperium. Fiercely dedicated to his Primarch, Ardellus stood with him when he turned against the Emperor. It is rumored that he was the one responsible for the quiet purge of the Salamander's own ranks prior to the Istvan massacre, ensuring that those who would still cling to their oaths of loyalty to the Imperium never reached the system alive. While he wasn't completely successful, his bloody-handed efforts participated in ensuring the slaughter of the loyal legions. On the Urgal Plateau, he led the Pyre Guard at the side of Fukin, fighting against the Night Guard while Kurz and Fukin battled. He is said to have crossed blade with Talos the Soul Hunter at that time, and to have locked eyes with him as Fukin killed the King of the Night. Ardellus fought during the entire heresy at his Primarch's side, and was present at the Siege of Terra and during the War of the Dragon. When the Salamanders were defeated and Fukin departed through the warp, however, Ardellus was unable to follow. Instead, he gathered the rest of the Legion and directed their retreat from the 8th Legion's fury, abandoning the relics of Conrad Kurz in the hasty withdrawal. While this saved the lives of thousands of legionaries from the vengeance of the Night Lords and their Sons of Horus allies, it would eventually cost the first captain everything. When Fukin's call reached the Legion, Ardellus convinced several of the Legion's captains to go into the Eye of Terror, while they wanted to remain in Imperial space and continue their raids rather than enter the storm of madness and chaos. He single-handedly kept the Legion from falling to pieces on the way to the Daemon world where Fukin had risen, his devotion to the Lord of Drakes strong enough to keep the very ships of the Salamanders sailing together in the storms. When at last the fleet reached the planet, he was the first mortal salamander to set foot upon it, and the first to stand before his Primarch in all of his reborn, infernal glory. Instead of rewarding him for his loyal service, Fukin unleashed all of his fury at his condition and the loss of Kurz's relics on his faithful equerry. Ardellus didn't die, but his mind was shattered by Fukin's wrath. His faith in Fukin, a core part of his being, was ripped away when he beheld what the Black Dragon had become, and his soul was defenseless when exposed to the raw insanity of the energies that fueled the Daemon Primarch's body. His body and mind were twisted as parts of his soul were torn off and devoured by the Neverborn created from Fukin's violent outburst. Despair, horror, and insanity poured into the void, and only a wretched shell of the once powerful commander remained in the aftermath. The fate of the one the Salamanders now call the Broken Devotee is thought to have played a huge part in the splintering of the 18th Legion after their arrival in the Eye of Terror. With their Primarch gone mad with rage and the only other possible leader ruined beyond salvation, each captain took what forces he could gather and left, seeking his own fortunes in the Great Eye rather than remain near Fukin and risk being the next victim of his insane fury. As to Ardellus himself, he lives still, in a fashion, and wanders the Eye through means unknown but doubtlessly heretical. According to tales whispered among Eye-based warbands, he has gained some strange, arcane insight from his madness. Seen as a sign of ill luck by the Salamanders and the other traitor legions, he has nonetheless survived in some of the most hostile worlds within the Eye of Terror, despite being utterly unable to fight. Sometimes, deluded cults gather around him and follow him in his journeys, listening to his insane ramblings and writing them down, desperate to find some meaning among the madness. On many occasions, Chaos Lords have sought the Broken Devotee with questions of their own, and several have even received an answer to their queries. Eventually, however, Fukin's rage abated, or at least cooled down. The Salamanders returned to him, and he gave them all a single command: that they go out across the galaxy and plunder its worlds, bringing back the result of their plunder to this world so that he might claim his share as their lord and master. It is said that some salamander lords tried to refuse this decree, unwilling to part with any of their ill-gotten gains. What became of them is the subject of much speculation, but we do know that all current salamander warbands pay Fukin's tithe. Fukin also formed the Promethean Conclave, to ensure the continuity of his gene line even now that he could no longer donate genetic material to create new progenoid glands. His return from wrathful madness essentially saved the Salamander's legion from destroying itself in the insanity of the Eye of Terror. For the second time now, Fukin had pulled the 18th from the very brink of extinction, in an event that is now called the Refurging. When the Imperium learned of this, the legions began to prepare, convinced that another Black Crusade was on its way. But soon after re-establishing his rule over the 18th Legion, Fukin fell back into lethargy, spending the years laying upon his ever-growing treasure, his mind cast adrift into the tides of the warp, where he plots and schemes to gain yet more wealth and power. But the Salamanders remember his wrath well, and they are cautious to obey his edicts and, on the rare occasions where his consciousness returns to his body and he summons one of them to give him particular orders, they all do his bidding. Whenever this happens, the ripples in the Sea of Souls are large enough that they are almost always picked up by the seers of the Thousand Suns or the psychers and astropaths stationed in the iron cage around the Eye of Terror. Interpreting the visions, however, is another matter entirely, and hundreds of psychers have been lost to madness trying to decipher the Black Dragon's commands to his minions. Even the minds of a few sons of Magnus have been shattered by the darkness of these images, and were mournfully put down by their brothers to end their torment. Still, a lot has been learned from these sacrifices. Generally speaking, there are three types of quest Fukin might send one of his sons on: attacking a particular enemy, either to punish old offenses or to influence the balance of power in some distant conflict, acquiring a particular item and bringing it back to Fukin's treasure, and tracking down and killing another salamander who has committed crimes against the Legion, such as disobeying Fukin's orders or trying to bypass the Promethean Conclave. Those receiving Fukin's command also receive some measure of his influence over the warp. Their journeys through the Sea of Souls will be swifter and relatively safer, and if they have sorcerers under their employ or mystical abilities of their own, daemons will be more open to their demands and pacts. The most recent and infamous such dark appointment that the Imperium is aware of was the one that led to the Black Crusade recorded in Imperial archives as the Gothic War, at the dawn of the 41st millennium's 2nd century. Fukin ordered Cassian Dracos to gather a great fleet of the lost and the damned and invade the Gothic sector. Dracos was a Chaos Dreadnought who had retained his sanity since the days of the Roboutian Heresy, and was even more ancient than that, having led the 18th Legion in the days before Fukin was found. While Cassian was appointed as the leader of the Black Crusade, the Black Dragon had laid the seeds of heresy and ruin in the Gothic sector beforehand. At his signal, cast across the Sea of Souls, rebellions erupted all across the sector as the disciples of the dragon revealed their treachery. Entire battle groups of Battlefleet Gothic turned traitor, and planets fell to civil war as loyalists struggled against those who had embraced the lies of the dragon. Meanwhile, the warp itself erupted in storms of rare violence, isolating the sector from reinforcements. For several years, it was all Sector Command could do to keep this region of Imperial space from simply falling apart. Lord Admiral Cornelius von Ravensburg directed the forces under his command to assist Imperial worlds and stop rebellious battle groups, but his resources were spread thin, and then the Salamanders, the architects behind the woes of the Gothic sector, arrived. Their fleet had taken long and secret paths through the warp to bypass the iron cage, losing dozens of vessels on their way. But these losses mattered nothing to Cassian, who was spurred forward by Fukin's command and the fear of his wrath should he fail. The mission Fukin had given to the Revenant, as Cassian was known among his legion, was to acquire the legendary Blackstone fortresses. 6 of these massive, ancient starships of unknown, probably alien origin were scattered across the Gothic sector, used by the Imperial Navy as bases. Though their true function and capabilities were as unknown as their origins, the Adeptus Mechanicus had refitted each of the Blackstone fortresses with massive weaponry and life supports to turn them into orbital fortresses of a scale and power rarely seen in the Imperium. Cassian's flagship in the Gothic War was the Ebon Drake, a hideous vessel born in the infernal forges of the Eye of Terror. More than a dozen different forge fathers had worked on its design and construction, and it carried within it weapons capable of ripping entire worlds apart, which led to Imperial forces naming it Planet Killer. Several warbands of salamanders had joined Cassion's crusade, as had hundreds of pirate and raider vessels. Worse still, Cassion had a personal knowledge of the Gothic sector, having been part of the traitor forces that had conquered Port Ma for Guilliman's side during the Roboutian Heresy, 10 millennia ago. The traitors outnumbered and outgunned battle fleet Gothic, but the servants of the Imperium had something their enemies did not: courage, discipline, and faith in the God Emperor. Despite these advantages, the Imperium suffered greatly in the first years of the war. Entire systems were lost, their population slaughtered or enslaved. It was later discovered that this first massive invasion was intended as a cover for Cassion's true goal. In order to awaken the full power of the Blackstone fortresses and control them, the Chaos Lord needed two relics held on Imperial worlds, the Hand of Darkness, and the Eye of Night. The Ebon Drake led Chaos forces in raids upon the two planets that held these artifacts, Purgatory and Orn's world. Both of these planets were left by the salamanders as lifeless husks in order to hide their tracks. But this unusual behavior instead led Inquisitor Horst, responsible for investigating the schemes of chaos in the Gothic sector, to finally uncover the Black Crusade's true purpose. Despite several attempts by Horst and his agents at reclaiming the relics from the traitors' hands, Cassion was able to activate and control one of the Blackstone fortresses. He used it along with the rest of his forces to devastating effect on the cardinal world of Sevaven, combining their power in order to reduce the massive defensive fleet to slag before the Ebon Drake unleashed its full complement of weapons upon the planet, shattering it to pieces. The impact on Imperial morale across the sector was devastating, and reluctantly, Admiral Ravensburg began to make plans to destroy the remaining Blackstone fortresses rather than allow them to fall under renegade control. But he was unable to implement them before Cassion seized control of another fortress in the Lucatar system, and then another again at Fullerus II. There, the true threat of the Blackstone fortresses was revealed. At the Revenant's command, the space stations combined their energies and unleashed a pulse that cleansed Fullerus II of all life. Forced to face both the Chaos incursion and piratical raids, Battlefleet Gothic was at its breaking point. The pirates were not only human renegades, but also Orc freebooters and Eldar corsairs. The Xenos targeted the Chaos forces as well as the Imperials, but without stable and secure supply lines, Ravensburg was losing battle group after battle group. Then, salvation came from the most unlikely of sources. Recently promoted Admiral Spire managed to establish contact with the Eldar leader in the sector. The exact details are lost to time and inquisitorial secrecy, but Spire managed to convince the Xenos to join forces against the archenemy rather than risk Cassion gain control of all Blackstone fortresses, a prospect that seemed to unnerve even the arrogant Eldar. With the aid of the Eldar, Spire was able to learn the location of the Pirates' Haven, where the human renegades of the sector had made their base. With this information, Fleet Admiral Morndark gathered his forces and struck, destroying almost the entirety of human piracy in the sector. Meanwhile, Spire led a daring assault upon the Orcs' freebooters, his flagship matching the Greenskins' massive, ugly vessels and pounding them into wreckage. With his supply lines finally secure, Admiral Ravensburg focused his full attention upon the Salamanders and their chaotic allies, and went on the offensive. In the Gethsemane system, his forces encountered a massive splinter of the Chaos Armada, and forced it to retreat, only for it to fall in an ambush by Eldar vessels, who destroyed the fleeing fleet completely. This battle reinforced the uneasy truce between Eldar and Imperial in the Gothic War, though official documents never actually call it an alliance. This marked the beginning of the Imperium's counterattack. Ravensburg used the division of his enemy to his advantage, striking isolated groups with massive force to wipe them out one by one. Aboard the Ebon Drake, Cassion saw this and understood clearly his foe's strategy, and also understood that he could do nothing about it. The Chaos Armada was long since beyond his control, with most ships doing as their captain pleased, gathered in loose packs rampaging and plundering at will. Only a small core of the fleet remained under his direct command, but even that was a considerable force, especially considering the might of the Ebon Drake and the three Blackstone fortresses. At the same time, the warp storms roused by Fukin's plots began to abate, and reinforcements from the rest of the Imperium began to arrive in the Gothic sector. The prospect of defeat, and the wrath of his Primarch, began to creep on the Revenant, and he reacted with all the callousness and cunning of one of the Black Dragon's sons. Cassion launched an all-out raid on the Durantis system, ensuring that the cries for aid of its population would reach the Imperium along with news of his presence there. Forces from Battlefleet Gothic, Agrippina and Cadia rushed in, each captain hungry for the glory that would be his if he could claim the head of the arch-heretic. Before the battle could begin, however, Cassian combined the might of his 3 Blackstone fortresses and fired into Durantus' sun, before ordering his forces to flee into the warp. Mere minutes later, as the Imperial forces were still trying to figure out what to do, the star went supernova, killing billions, and destroying all ships still in the system. Ravensburg prepared to go in pursuit, but his Eldar allies stopped him. They told him that their seers believed Cassian would continue his mission regardless of the risks, and attempt to seize the Blackstone fortresses still in Imperial hands. The Xenos scouts had discovered that the next target of the Revenant would be the Blackstone fortress orbiting the world of Skinned Legist. Using the webway, both Eldar and Imperial forces arrived to this system just as the Chaos Armada emerged from the warp, and the final battle of the Gothic War began. Fighting together, Eldar and Imperial ships managed to break the lines of the Chaos Armada, and the heroic sacrifice of Captain Abridal and his ship prevented the Blackstone fortresses from doing at Skinned Legist as they had at Durantus. By sending his ship straight in the energy beams linking the fortresses, the captain disrupted the firing mechanism and gave the rest of the fleet time, though it cost his life and that of his entire crew as his vessel was utterly disintegrated. In the end, with the aid of a contingent of the World Eaters, Ravensburg was able to reclaim one of the Blackstone fortresses Cassian had taken. Sensing that the tide had turned against him, Cassian decided to cut his losses and withdrew his forces, taking the Ebon Drake along with his 2 remaining Blackstone fortresses back with him into the Eye of Terror, abandoning the rest of his forces to slow down Imperial pursuit. It took several decades to completely cleanse the Gothic sector of the remnants of the Black Crusade. The names of every member of the Imperial Navy who fought during the Gothic War are inscribed upon a gigantic slab of adamantium on Terra, a fitting monument to their heroism. Admiral Spire attempted to pursue Cassian, but his forces were defeated, and he was rescued from certain death by ships of the 12th Legion arriving just in time to force the traitors to flee before delivering the killing blow to his crippled ship. He would later prove his worth once more at the Iron Cage, fighting at the side of the Iron Warriors to keep the traitor legions contained and earning the respect of even Perturabo's doer sons. Of the 2 Blackstone fortresses stolen by Cassian, nothing was ever heard of again. The remaining fortresses still in Imperial hands were destroyed, as it was feared that they would be turned against the Imperium in the future. The Ebon Drake has never been seen since the Gothic War, nor has Cassian Dracos. Whether the Revenant survived returning to his Primarch with only 2 Blackstone fortresses, the Hand of Darkness and the Eye of Night, is unknown even to the seers of the Thousand Suns and the agents of the Inquisition. Today, the Salamanders are as divided as any traitor legion, their ambitions pitting them against one another while their father Slum bears on enough wealth to build several entire sectors. Yet according to the visions of sanctioned seers and the captured writings of deluded cultists, the wounds inflicted by Mortarion and Magnus 10,000 years ago have long since healed. For now, Fukin is content to remain in his domain, ruling it with an iron fist while his sons wander the stars in search of wealth and glory. But should the Black Dragon ever rise from his slumber, leaving the higher ebbs of the great game of chaos behind, the entire legion would gather under him once more, drawn by fear of reprisal and the promise of plunder and power, if not by actual loyalty to their gene-sire. Should such an event happen, then the only thing that might preserve the Iron Cage from the wrath of Fukin might be, ironically enough, the other Daemon Primarches, rising from their own exiles to prevent their brother from claiming that which they themselves have failed to seize. The Disciples of the Dragon. One of the most pernicious and enduring cults to have ever plagued the Imperium, the Disciples of the Dragon are heretics spread among the Imperium's own ruling elite. Members of this debased cult worship Fukin as the true master of mankind, holding that the Emperor was slain at Guilliman's hands. They also believe themselves to be Fukin's chosen, destined to rule over the inferior masses of humanity in the name of the Black Dragon. The truth is that they are naught but pawns, easily cast away by their masters, for those who are genuinely in contact with the Salamander's legion. Only the most powerful and successful cells manage to draw legionary attention. When they do, the Salamanders use the Disciples to infiltrate the high spheres of Imperial command and prepare the ground for their own conquest. Several times, an invasion by the 18th Legion has been met by the governor and the other officials kneeling before the invaders, only for the people themselves to rally behind new, low-born leaders that the disciples would never have considered worthy of including in their plans. Whether or not such resistance appeared is often the only thing preventing an inquisitor from declaring exterminatus on a planet whose lords surrendered without a fight. Captured records and journals of cultists have revealed that the same pattern repeats itself in the creation of every cell. An individual of some influence, with the greed and ambition favored by the salamanders and with latent psychic powers, will receive visions featuring Fukin himself. These visions will twist his mind and grant him infernal knowledge, turning him into a prophet of the Black Dragon. He, or she, gender does not seem to play any part in this, will then start to recruit others, drawing them with promises of greater wealth and power. Whether the visions are actually sent by the daemon Primarch or by lesser Neverborn posing as him is unknown. Certainly some of the cult leaders of the disciples have displayed mutations similar to those generally observed upon the salamanders, and their sorcerers have shown some mastery of the dread arts of resurrection, using them to increase their hold over the cult. The suppression of all knowledge related to the ruinous powers in the Imperium actively works against the Inquisition in fighting the disciples. Each cell believes itself to be the first of its kind, the true chosen of their draconic god rather than just another band of foolish puppets. The disciples seek to gather power and wealth while weakening the hold of the Imperial Adepta at the same time, with the goal of one day seizing the reins of power for themselves. They perform regular ceremonies in which they pay homage to Fukin in return for dark gifts from their patron. Such is the corruption caused by these rituals that cultists turning on each other is common, especially at what should have been the cult's moment of triumph. Organization. Though Fukin still rules the 18th Legion, and all salamanders ultimately owe him allegiance, the Black Dragon has not departed his lair in the Eye of Terror in millennia. In reality, the salamanders are divided into many warbands. Loyalty is a sham in all traitor legions, but within the 18th even more so, as the salamanders only respect power, and only truly care for themselves. Fear of Fukin's wrath prevents the salamanders from outright rejecting his dominance over them, though, save for a few fools who rarely live long, for though Fukin does not leave his demonic world, his agents are many and powerful. Rivalry between legionaries, however, is extremely common, and only the most powerful, cunning, and vicious Chaos Lords can manage not only to prevent their warriors from turning against them, but also keep them from each other's throat. The old legion's hierarchy is all but gone, as few salamanders alive care for the ranks they might have held during the Great Crusade and the Heresy. Every salamander leader carries a different title depending on his nature, deeds and power. Lord Brayarth Ashmantle, for instance, earned his title from the cloak he wears, fashioned from black diamonds made of the compressed ashes of his victims. The salamanders take these titles very seriously, and duels to the death have been declared between two Chaos Lords of the 18th Legion who happened to have laid claim to the same self-aggrandizing title. Each salamander lord leads a warband in his image, made up of a corps of traitor marines and many more slaves. A warband's size, power, and resources are a reflection of its leaders, and the Chaos Lords compete ruthlessly to be masters of the most powerful warband under the eye of Fukin. Warbands vary greatly in size, but the temper of the salamanders prevent more than a few hundred legionaries being gathered together, though no such problem poses itself with their mortal slave armies. The Forge Fathers. There are those among the ranks of the salamanders who do not bear the same mentality as the rest of Fukin's spawn, those possessed of a mind turned away from glory in battle and immortality. Whether they are the result of a genetic quirk or some manifestation of Fukin's own hidden thoughts, these individuals are nonetheless extremely dangerous and just as greedy as the rest of their brothers, turning their talents to the forging of weapons rather than the domination and plunder of others. These warriors are known as the Forge Fathers, and over the centuries the Imperium has learned to curse their names. A Forge Father is a scientist of the arcane and student of the dark arts, who combines the darkest of forbidden technologies with warp-tainted lore to create instruments of death and destruction. Endowed with knowledge that would make any archmagos of the Dark Mechanicum weep with envy, these heirs to the Legion's old tech marines wander the Eye of Terror and beyond in search of ancient weaponry to study and replicate. They are known to have a particular fascination for the Eldar, as these Xenos still possess many relics from the glory days of their lost empire. More than one craft world has burned in the pyres of war so that a Forge Father could gain access to its forbidden vaults. With the rise of the Necrons, the Forge Fathers have discovered a new source of wondrous and terrible technology, though even they are wary of the soulless lords of the Tomb Worlds. The Forge Fathers also seek the legacy of Fukin, hunting down for the lost relics of their Primarch. With the Black Dragon himself grown distant and unable to forge his own weapons, they believe that it falls to them to protect and inherit what he left behind, in the hope that one day they might equal his genius in armament construction. Most Forge Fathers are solitary creatures, toiling in their workshops surrounded by the sound of infernal machinery and the moaning of slaves doing their bidding. From Exterminatus-grade doomsday weapons to demonic blades and infernal war machines, the Forge Fathers do not limit their art to a single avenue. Sooner or later, however, they will want to test their creations in the field, and seek a patron or ally to provide them with a suitable battlefield. Warlords of the Eye have long since learned that while the creations of a Forge Father might be unpredictable, their sheer destructive power more than makes up for however many slaves are lost in the process. The Forge Fathers prefer to fight alongside other salamanders, but most have no problem lending their services to a warlord from another legion, though their legionary pride will prevent them from treating with a human warlord as an equal. Valuable alliances have been made that way, with the Forge Father returning to his fortress loaded with loot and notes on how to enhance his prototypes, and the Chaos Lord sporting a new daemon blade hanging at his side. Combat Doctrine. Kneel before the dragon, or you will be knelt. Proclamation of Chaos Lord Bray Arthashmental, before the complete purge of the Shrine World Innocence 3, M38. In battle, the Salamanders are a terrifying foe to face. Thanks to the blood of Fukin, each of them is very resilient to injury, capable of enduring wounds that would have killed a pure Astaroth several times. They have a morbid obsession with fire-based weaponry, and many of them carry huge flamers, either using classic promethium or sprouting demonic flames that burn the soul as well as the flesh. Their sorcerers have also developed their own Sorcerous version of pyromancy, calling upon the inner fire of Fukin within their souls and unleashing it upon the material plane. The Salamanders have no compunction with arming their servants, and they rarely go to war without armies of mutants and debased cultists at their side. Hordes of the lost and the damned are sent forward by their Astaroth's overlords, dying in the hundreds to test the enemy's defenses and soften them for the Salamander's own assault. These wretches are recruited from warlike inhabitants of the Daemon worlds in the Eye of Terror, renegade Imperial Guard regiments, or masses of slaves driven mad by the horrors of chaos and given the most basic weapons and armor. Like all tyrants, the Salamanders enjoy nothing more than crushing those weaker than themselves. Because of this, they have a deep interest in Xenos civilizations from beyond the borders of the Imperium. More than one rogue trader has discovered a planet that once housed a prosperous alien culture, now reduced to empty, haunted ruins, with only the mark of the dragon left behind as a sign to future explorers that it was Fukin's children who destroyed it. At times, however, warbands of the 18th Legion have encountered alien empires stronger than anticipated, and fled back to their infernal realm, leaving the Imperium to bear the wrath of these roused threats. Still, such is the power of the Salamanders that they leave far more empty, plundered graveyards than enraged enemies of mankind in their wake. The Forge Fathers are known to favor these expeditions into the unknown, hungering for new blasphemous knowledge to add to their dark designs, and the Salamanders maintain ties with entire fleets of Dark Mechanicum exploration fleets and renegades in order to learn of new prey. While the Salamanders are known to perform the acts of piracy that Traitor Legion warbands are infamous for, they are more adept at full-scale planetary conquest. Using the Disciples of the Dragon, the Salamanders will identify weakened worlds within the Imperium's borders, and strike at them with the full strength at their disposal, crushing any orbital defense capability and landing forces in the middle of Imperial centers of command, while cultists and infiltrated human squads will run acts of terrorism to spread chaos and confusion. After the leaders of the Imperium on the planet have been captured, compromised, or slain, the purge of the planet's defenders begin. The greatest concentrations of forces will be taken out by orbital weapons, while the Salamanders themselves will march to war behind the ranks of their slave armies, pitting their heavy armor against the defenders and slaughtering the infantry with their flamers and sorcery. Once the defenders have all been crushed, the Salamanders will then turn their attention to the planet's population, even as packs rampage through the spires and nobility houses, reveling in the joy of plunder. To the Salamanders, simply butchering these defenseless captives is a waste of time and ammunition, and so they refrain from simply ordering mass executions or letting loose the worst elements of their human slaves. But while the people might be spared the wanton death and destruction that so often follow in the wake of the other traitor legions, the fate prepared for them by the Salamanders is arguably far worse. For another known battle tradition of the salamanders is the branding, and it reflects the view of the drakes upon common mankind perfectly. On captured human worlds, the salamanders mark all humans like cattle with dragon-shaped fire brands. This mark has been observed to induce spiritual and physical corruption that only the strongest of will and purest of faith can resist. The mark erodes at individuality and empathy, turning humans into little more than servitors, all beyond their working skills burned away. Some radical inquisitors have studied this, hoping to replicate the effect on unruly worlds of the Imperium. They are, of course, considered the most blasphemous heretics by the ecclesiarchy and the rest of the holy ordos. The World Eaters are also known to have reacted very violently after liberating worlds from the salamanders and discovering the branding inflicted upon its population. Many oaths of vengeance against the 18th Legion are kept in the records of the Sons of Angron, whose hatred for slavery is unmatched in the entire Imperium. Once marked, the captives are forced to work in conditions that would put even the most ruthless Spire-born manufactorium owner to shame. Yet the true horror lies in the way that even as these people are doomed to eventually succumb to the exertions of their work, they will not do so for years, long enough to reproduce and give birth to a new generation of slaves to serve their cruel masters. An entire population is thus reduced to little more than cattle, serving the salamanders as they plunder the resources of the planet they have conquered. All material wealth is taken aboard the Legion's ships, as are those with the skills to make useful slaves. When the Imperium inevitably retaliates, the salamanders callously destroy the infrastructure they had thus far left untouched to optimize productivity and depart, leaving behind billions that, unless Imperial help arrives soon, will starve to death in a matter of weeks. Even then, the nightmare of these people is not over, as the Inquisition arrives in force to purge the survivors from anyone who has succumbed to the Black Dragon's malevolent influence. The brand also often leads to global purges, the planet being later resettled with untainted colonists, unaware of their new home's bloody past. For a select few, this fate can be averted, and the branding is removed surgically, while they spend the rest of their lives under the watchful gaze of the Inquisition. Between their numbers, their mortal armies and the terrible weapons crafted by the Forge Fathers, the salamanders represent the greatest threat to the Imperium among the Traitor Legion, at least from a purely military perspective. Their lack of ability to join forces thanks to Fukin's distance is the only thing preventing the 18th Legion from crashing through the Iron Cage in the most destructive Black Crusade ever seen. The Burning Man. A figure of legend, whispered about by the shocked survivors of some salamanders' invasion, it is unsure whether or not the Burning Man really exists. Many accounts tell of this creature that appears on battlefields where the salamanders are involved. In some tales, there is a screaming, melting silhouette of fuming flesh and blackened bone inside the inferno, while in others the Burning Man is truly made purely of flames. In some accounts, he hunts down the civilians hiding in the ruins of their homes while the salamanders hunt down the last defenders of their fallen city, while in others he attacks the salamanders themselves as they discover the hiding places of cowering children. There are several theories among the ranks of the Inquisition concerning the true nature of the Burning Man. Some believe it to be nothing more than a name attributed to different occurrences of the salamander sorcerers using their own particular form of pyromancy, and sometimes losing control over their unholy powers. Others believe that there is a single Burning Man, a spiritual entity born from a salamander loyalist that was betrayed by his brothers during the Roboutian Heresy and put to the pyre, only for his vengeful shade to haunt the Legion forever afterwards. A fringe theory even suggests that he is the incarnation of the salamander's lost humanity, their buried, all but dead conscience, reaching out through the warp and tormenting them from beyond their genetic reforging and indoctrination. Homeworld. The legacy of the dragon. Even after the scourging was declared complete and celebrated in triumph across the Imperium, not all traces of the salamander's evil were successfully expunged. The War of the Dragon had raged across several sectors, and Fukin's grand plan to ascend to the rank of Daemon Prince was one with many contingencies and backups. In order to secure his legend among the fearful masses of the Imperium, Fukin ordered that the vaults of treasures he had gathered during the Great Crusade be opened, their contents spread across the entire galaxy while the vaults were filled anew with fresh plunder. According to the theories of the Inquisition's scholars of damnation, these were supposed to reinforce Fukin's spiritual imprint upon the galaxy, so that he might ascend without the need for a patron among the dark gods. Whether or not this plan worked or Fukin's transfiguration was the reward bestowed upon him by the entire ruinous pantheon, the consequences of this legacy remain the same. Many relics, weapons, and hidden bases of the salamanders were left hidden on worlds that were later reclaimed or recolonized by the Imperium. With distressing regularity, a relic of the Black Dragon will emerge on an Imperial world, causing strife and turmoil and eventually calling the salamanders to it. The Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus have hunted these relics for 10,000 years, but on several occasions their vaults themselves have been raided by the 18th Legion forces. Currently, every piece of what is often called the Dragon's legacy in possession of the Ordo has been sealed deep below the surface of Titan, under the watchful guard of the Grey Knights themselves, hopefully beyond the reach of even the most determined Forge Father. After the destruction of Nocturne and their exile into the Eye of Terror, the Salamanders were quick to claim another planet as their home world. This Daemon world is located deep within the Eye of Terror, where reality and unreality are inextricably merged and the will of Daemon and mortal alike can shape the surroundings. No will on Hephaeros, as the demonic home world of the 18th Legion is known, is stronger than that of Fukin, and so the world is the toy of the Black Dragon's whims. The surface of Hephaeros is covered in oceans of lava spilling from immense volcanoes that rise and are subsumed in a matter of hours, while the earth quakes with Fukin's own smoldering rage. The Legion's infrastructure on the planet is located below the surface, in great caverns held together by sorcery and the will of their inhabitants. It is within these caves that the Salamander warlords gather their plunder, under the guard of the best wards cast by their sorcerers and the secrecy of their location. Only caves whose existence is known only to the Chaos Lord are considered worthy. Mountains of gold and other riches are amassed in these great caverns, and the slaves tasked with carrying the wealth are often left behind, to avoid them revealing the location of their lord's treasure. If they are lucky, the treasure will include means for them to sustain themselves as they count their master's wealth over and over so that they can tell him the worth of his vault when he returns. Most, though, die of thirst within a few days, or fall victim to daemons born of their delusions. Other underground caves are home to vast industrial complexes, immense forges where hordes of slaves toil endlessly to produce the weapons and armor required by the salamanders and their armies of human bolter fodder. Blacksmiths from all across the galaxy are held captive here, with the best being granted better living conditions so that they can continue working longer. Most captives are human, or something based on the human genetic code, but there are also Eldar, Rakgol, and many daemons bound within hosts or fully manifested, all working to create the tools of war needed by their merciless overlords. Some of these workers are the last of their entire species, prisoners brought from ruined worlds to serve for the Salamander's benefit and amusement. A caste of cruel iron-masked daemon-human hybrids known only as the Overseers rule over these forges, managing the flux of minerals from the planet's molten core and the trade with the warbands present in orbit, with the most common currency asked in return for the forge's products being the food and water required to keep their best slaves alive, and the new flesh to replace those who died. There is only one permanent, above-ground structure on the entire planet, the Tower of the Promethean Conclave, the Dark Mechanicum group responsible for the creation of new salamanders. Rising hundreds of kilometers in the sky, it only exists because of Fukin's continued will and the impossible physics of the Eye of Terror, and reaches all the way up to the orbital installations of Hephaeros. These installations are massive shipyards, capable of receiving hundreds of ships at once. While the ships of the Legion are given priority for repair and resupply, the shipyards also service those of the Legion's allies, and even, in some cases, the vessels of warlords from other legions who have proved to be friends of the Salamanders. It is aboard these orbital structures that trade with the Overseers take place, with the warlords meeting the Overseers' envoys and negotiating prices until both sides come to an agreement, or until the Salamander kills the Overseer in a bout of rage and needs to wait for another envoy to arrive, so that the negotiations can start over once the killing fee of the previous negotiator has been paid. Beliefs. Power is the only thing that truly matters. Motto of the Salamander's Traitor Legion. To be a Salamander is to believe that might makes more than right, it makes everything. Without power, one is nothing in the galaxy, unable to protect or take anything. Power, therefore, is measured in the amount that one is able to claim and defend as one's own. Such is the twisted philosophy of the Salamanders, and the true wellspring of their greed. The sons of Fukin care nothing for the piles of gold and treasure they plunder from the Imperium's worlds, or the relics they steal from rival warbands and pile in their vaults, All that mattered to them is that these things were valued by someone and that they had the strength to take them. Immortality is the second goal of every salamander, and it is just as important to them as power, for what worth is power that you lose when you die? As the sons of undying Fukin, each salamander believes that immortality is his birthright, and he will fight, betray, and kill anyone in order to claim it. Be it by pacts with demonic entities, the pursuit of their gene line's secrets or the forbidden research of the Draconites, they will use every means to ensure their continued existence. This obsession has cost the salamanders in resources, but it has also ensured that their numbers remain stable across the ages despite one of the slowest recruitment rates of the traitor legions. They are simply too hard to kill. The salamanders worship their daemon Primarch as a god, seeing him as the source of their power just as much as they envy him for it. They believe that they have inherited his immortality, and that if they prove worthy of it by their deeds, the potential for eternity that lies within them will blossom and they will be reborn as immortals themselves. They acknowledge the existence and might of the ruinous powers, and have made alliances with demonic forces of all four dark gods, but save for a few heretics hunted down by their brothers, the 18th Legion does not worship chaos itself. It is possible that this is all a sham, a dark and terrible joke played by the ruinous powers over the salamanders, but the alternative is worrying indeed. Several salamanders have already succeeded in their quest for damnable transcendence, shedding their mortality along with their souls and becoming daemon princes unfettered to any of the dark gods. Several occult savants of the Inquisition have theorized that Fukin, believed for 10,000 years to have become a daemon prince of chaos undivided, might actually be transforming into something altogether more powerful and corrupt. They fear that, through the constant worship of legions of cultists and fearful slaves, he might be becoming a new, true ruinous power, independent of any of the four dark gods. In the writings of these scholars, before madness and suicide inevitably take them, Fukin might become a divinity of tyranny and greed, the incarnation of the worst aspect of the human psyche not already reflected by one of the ruinous powers. The Draconite Inquisitors. Such is the tempting power of immortality's promise that even members of the Inquisition have succumbed to it over the millennia. Known as Draconite Inquisitors, the first of these radicals fell to ruin when they investigated Fukin's immortality in the hope of finding a way to bring the Emperor's own physical body back to life. Eventually, their research drove them mad, with many of them starting to believe that Fukin ought to replace the God Emperor as the master of mankind and rule as a true immortal emperor. When their heresy was discovered in M33, all members of the faction were declared excommunicate traitores, and hunted down without mercy by the rest of the Inquisition. The resulting conflict was one of the most devastating so-called Inquisition wars, as the Draconites' desire to resurrect the Emperor had made them many allies among the ecclesiarchy, and they did not hesitate to call upon them for aid. Even the Night Lords in Alpha Legion were called in to prevent the destruction from spreading too much, as the Draconite Inquisitors unleashed the darkest, most forbidden products of their heretical research. That move proved to be a mistake, for it eventually alienated them from their last allies left in the Imperium as the true depths of their heresy were revealed and daemons, undead and other, stranger things were loosed upon the faction's enemies. In the end, the heretics were destroyed, their power bases annihilated and their allies captured and executed after thorough interrogation. Yet some of them managed to escape the Emperor's judgment, fleeing to the darker corners of the galaxy or into the Eye of Terror itself. There, they pledged themselves to Fukin, kneeling at the feet of the Daemon Primarch and swearing their eternal souls to his service. At the command of the Black Dragon, they were schooled in the demonic arts by the sorcerers of the Salamanders and the Forge Fathers. Then some were sent back to the Imperium, where they combined their inquisitorial background with their new talents to perform fell miracles among the ignorant population, subverting communities from within and corrupting key individuals. These Draconites are known to be able to raise the dead, though it is only an illusion. What they are actually doing is summoning a daemon and binding it into the corpse so that it can give it the impression of life, deceiving even the closest family members with a mix of acting and mind-clouding sorcery. Unlike the disciples of the dragon, the chaos-influenced Draconites most often work with the lower classes of human society, spreading their lies and fostering rebellion and heresy. Some of them remained in the Eye of Terror to help their master further their influence there or continue their research into the dark arts, and it is said that even the primogenitor has taken an interest in their work. Other survivors of the faction's initial purge, in the outer regions of the galaxy, continued their research into immortality and resurrection without ever coming into contact with the Black Dragon. By using Zeno's technology, forbidden gene forging and the heretic known as Anima Mori, they seek to master the boundary between life and death. Many such Draconites have long since forgotten their original purpose, instead focusing on achieving immortality for themselves and their servants. Their activities are responsible for countless heretical cults and atrocities, such as the Night of the Dead, when an entire cemetery world, whose name was erased from all archives in the aftermath, suddenly spat back their occupants as shambling, hungry monstrosities after a Draconite activated an Archaeotech nano-weapon without truly understanding its function and dangers. They are also known for their actions in the Sarkassian sector, where they created the Credo Mortifex, a death cult of terrible power that, while still technically loyal to the Golden Throne, has embraced such heresies that it is forced to operate in the shadows as it prosecutes its war of vengeance against all agents of chaos. These two sects of Draconites, the devotees of Fukin and the Resurrectionists, have often clashed, and in many such cases, it is the people of the Imperium that have paid the price of the conflict. Yet both are enemies of the Imperium, marked for death on sight by the Inquisition. No mercy is to be given to them, even if some radical factions left in the Ordos believe that some things can be learned from their mad ramblings. From time to time, another servant of the Emperor is lost to the false promises of the Draconite Creed, succumbing to one or the other of its twin-faced corruption. When such a corruption is unveiled, the Inquisitor in question is immediately declared excommunicate traitoris, such is the potential moral threat of this particular heresy. Recruitment and genocide. In the fire of the forge, from death shall come new life, now and forevermore. The vow of the Promethean covenant. As soon as the Legion was founded, signs of mutation were blatantly obvious in the Salamander's genetic code. Every aspirant implanted with Fukin's gene seed suffered from the same symptoms as the transformation took hold: coal-black skin and red, burning eyes. However, since their fall to darkness, new mutations have appeared in the 18th gene stock. Now, as a salamander ages, scales will appear on his skin, his teeth will become fangs and his fingers claws. This transformation forces the salamanders to rely on slaves for maintaining their weapons and armor, as well as for any delicate duties, like piloting their fleet, heavy armor, or gunships. This dependence on human assistance has only made the sons of Fukin harsher upon their slaves, lest they realize how their seemingly all-powerful lords actually need them and rise in rebellion. Dissection reports from captured salamanders have also revealed that the bone structure of the sons of Fukin is hardened beyond even that of normal Astaroths, and their regeneration is much quicker and complete than in other legions. Given enough time, a salamander might even regrow a lost limb entirely, although given the violent lives led by Chaos Marines, it is unlikely he would willingly wait rather than seek an augmetic or vat-grown graft, or some other, darker replacement. The salamanders also develop reptilian traits, such as vertical slit pupils, forked tongues, and other disfigurements. In some cases, these mutations grow until the salamander becomes what is known as a dragon warrior. Dragon warriors. Some salamanders embrace the reptilian mutations that afflict their gene line, reveling in the power it grants them. These warriors, should they survive long enough, eventually transform into minor reflections of their primarch, the dragon warriors. They are fused with their power armor, which becomes covered in black scales before being subsumed into their own mutated flesh. Two great wings emerge from their back, giving them the ability to fly, while their bodies grow in size until they are as big as a Land Raider. Their hide becomes as impenetrable as Terminator warplate, and their limbs end in massive claws capable of tearing through tanks, while their heads get more elongated and their jaws filled with fangs the size of a normal Astartes fist. Their bellies are filled with the fire of chaos, that they can let loose in devastating breaths that consume flesh and soul alike, condemning those caught within the inferno to eternal damnation. Not all salamanders are capable of withstanding such transformation and retain their mental faculties, however. The warp reshapes its own according to their own nature, and those it remakes into dragon warriors are often the more bestial of their kind. Most lose themselves to the change, becoming little more than beasts that their brethren must chain and let loose in the general direction of the enemy when battle is joined. Still, they make for powerful guardians, and more than one salamander lord uses them to protect his vault from intruders. Those who do retain their minds, however, are some of the most dangerous living creatures in the entire galaxy. In them, the already legendary selfishness and pride of the salamanders is intensified even further, to the point that they do not even consider other living beings as sentient in the same sense as themselves. Most of them leave their legion behind, establishing their own petty kingdoms on isolated daemon worlds in the Eye of Terror, ruling over a terrified population of mutants and heretics. But those who do not shun the company of other transhumans often rise very high very quickly, becoming advisors to powerful Chaos Lords and gathering their own personal treasures rivaling those of the mightiest salamanders. Their pride makes it all but impossible for them to stay with others of their legion, but warbands from other sources are often more than willing to accept the services of such a powerful ally on the battlefield, regardless of the cost in plunder or the annoyance of suffering his arrogance. Their mind sharpened to a razor's edge, each of these intelligent dragon warriors is an army in himself, capable of inflicting untold damage to an army's morale as he bears down upon ground troops from above, carrying the charred remnants of their air support in his talons. Most of the salamanders' recruits come from the children of their slaves. Almost no apothecaries remain in the 18th Legion, the ambition driving Fukin's sons making them unsuited for such a nurturing task, and so, like so many other things, they depend upon mortal servants. In the early days of the Legion's exile, Fukin made a pact with a faction of the Dark Mechanicum, offering them his protection in return for their services in ensuring the continuity of his gene line. Known as the Promethean Conclave, these tech priests are allowed by all warbands to visit their ships and slave pens whenever they come to the Legion's home world. By Fukin's law, all Salamander's lords returning from their wars in the Eye and beyond must dock with the Conclave's tower, which is huge and high enough that their vessels can do so from orbit. These dreaded flesh masters take their pick of the human cattle, testing them for genetic compatibility and a myriad of other arcane parameters. Those deemed worthy are taken back to the Conclave's facilities on the Daemon world, along with the gene seed of the warbands fallen. There, they are transformed into new salamanders, their minds shattered by the horrors inflicted upon them until there is nothing left of the children they once were. Indoctrinated by the brutal conditions of their training and the endless preaching of hundreds of slaves singing the praises of Fukin, they are proud and cruel, clad in armor fashioned for them by the Covenant's allies elsewhere in the Eye. These new warriors are then brought to the spire's top, where they fight against daemons, servitors and slaves under the gaze of the Legion's lords present until one of them deems them worthy of joining his warband. Those who fail, die, as is the way of chaos. Over the millennia, some salamander lords have sought to dodge their responsibilities to the Conclave, gathering their own coteries of gene rights and building installations in hidden places across the Eye of Terror. They sought to create their own soldiers in order to increase their power without depending on the whims of the Conclave. Whenever word of one such transgression reaches Fukin's ear, however, his wrath is terrible, and he sends his servants to burn the installation to the ground and plunder all of its genetic material before bringing it back to the Promethean Conclave. The fate of the Lord responsible varies, but always ends in death, for Fukin tolerates no defiance of his edicts within his own legion. Warcry. One of the main reasons the salamanders fight is to prove their supremacy over their foes. As such, it only makes sense that they would make extensive use of battle cries to intimidate their enemy. As with all traitor legions, the cries used vary greatly from warband to warband, and many salamanders have their own personal challenge issued to those they are about to crush. Still, a few shouts have been recorded across the entire legion. For the dragon is favored by those highest in Fukin's esteem, while bow before the might of the salamanders, and we are the masters, you are the slaves, are often used when fighting against human enemies, to break them into submission. When fighting against the loyalist legions that were present at Istvan V, especially against the Night Lords, the salamanders match their faithful brothers' vengeful calls with a callous laughter of their own, as the memories of the slaughter on Black Sands are stirred within their genetic recollection. When exposed to this laughter, human units fighting alongside loyal legionaries have been known to break in tears without knowing why, as if mourning the loss of something that never was, but could have been magnificent. Tushan stood before his maker, and for the first time since the gene rights of the Covenant had taken him from his mother in the slave pits, he felt fear. Not the detached concern of plotting against his rivals and considering the possibility that his plans may fail, not the rush of adrenaline of the battlefield as he came closer to death than ever before, pure, animalistic fear, the kind which he had thought ascension had purged from his body. But he had been wrong. Fukin's presence filled the vault, blocking out even the awesome wealth it contained. There were the treasures of 100 heroes, stolen from every legion in the Eye and beyond. The sacred relics of 1,000 Xenos civilizations laid alongside enough gold to forge a dozen warships and buy several sectors. Technology that could reshape the surface of worlds was piled alongside trinkets that had been fashioned on old Earth more than 30,000 years ago. And yet these were nothing compared to the majesty of the Black Dragon. There were no mortal words that could describe him. Even Tushan, who had spent his entire life in the Eye of Terror, alongside countless Neverborn, was barely able to fully grasp the creature that occupied the chamber to which he had been summoned. All his mind could do was catch glimpses while refusing to commit the full picture to memory. Black scales the size of rhinos, fangs as sharp as the hunger of the fire that burned deep behind them, red eyes that glimmered with the patience and cruelty of millennia, and the voice. By all the treasures of the eye, the voice. Go to Uralan, my son. Find Draknian. Kill its guardian, and bring the blade to me. The Primarch of the Salamanders stretched his colossal wings, and Tushan almost fell flat on his back when the gust of wind hit him. Bring me a weapon worthy of my power, blood of my blood, flesh of my flesh. Bring me the end of empires, that I might finally bring down my father's failed kingdom. It shall be done, my lord, whispered Tushan, not trusting his voice to speak any louder. Check the description for the links to the author.